Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm looking for a motion to go into closed session, please. So I still have to acknowledge this, don't I? Okay. Les, seconded by Councillor McGarry. All those in favor? That's carried. Sorry about that. Or a motion to reconvene into open session, please. Councillor Armstrong, seconded by Councillor Shantz. All those in favor? Any declarations of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, I have no opening remarks, so we'll move forward with Mr. Murray's commentary. Oh, sorry. You want your 5 minutes? Well, let's see. We sat in a very interesting meeting just before this one. I'll leave that. Thank you. All right, great.
All right, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and welcome to Budget Committee meeting number 2 for the Region's 2020 budget. We are working our way through the process, and we'll be following this up with a subsequent meeting 2 weeks from now or so on December the 11th. So I thought I would just start off just briefly with just an overview of some of the considerable amount of information that's been provided to Council over the last little while with respect to the 2020 budget. So first of all the budget documents, the budget book, agendas, budget issue papers are certainly all available on the region's website, including the agendas for the various meetings. And in terms of what we wanted to accomplish today, we have a fair bit to get through over the course of the afternoon. We're going to start off with a presentation from the Grand River Conservation Authority with respect to some of their initiatives and their 2020 budget. We're then going to go into some detail with respect to our water and wastewater budgets, what we refer to as the user rate budgets. So we'll have a fairly detailed presentation on those. I'll continue with some updates on the tax-supported budget and capital program. This will be an opportunity for us to get into the proposed service expansions through budget issue papers in a little more detail than we did last time. We also have a number of information papers that are on today's agenda, again, which give a little bit more detail, a little more insight into the user rate budgets, as well as some proposed changes to our user fees and charges. We had a number of requests that were made for additional information coming out of the last meeting, a number of which we will answer through the course of today's slide deck. One or two items I think we're going to be bringing back on December the 11th, but I think we've dealt with most of them through today's report and through this slide deck. And then, of course, we have our first public input session, which is scheduled for 6 p.m. this evening. So with that, if there's no questions about the process or the agenda for today, I'm pleased to invite Samantha Lawson, the CAO for the Grand River Conservation Authority, to the podium to give us an overview of GRCA initiatives and the 2020 draft budget. That one gets you moving.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Regional Councillors, for allowing us to present the Grand River Conservation Authority Draft 2020 budget. My name is Samantha Lawson, and I am the CAO of the GRCA. I also have some fellow colleagues with me here today. I have Karen Armstrong, who is GRCA's Deputy CAO and Secretary Treasurer. I have Lisa Stucco, GRCA's Manager of Communications. And I have Sonia Radoja, who is the GRCA's Manager of Corporate Services. So for the first part of the presentation, I'm going to provide a high-level description of the GRCA and the challenges we are facing as a watershed agency. I will then highlight our strategic plan and how the GRCA is working to achieve them. And the second part of the presentation is going to be specific to GRCA's budget, but I'm going to pass that off to Sonia. The Grand River watershed is about 300 kilometers in length and has an area about the size of Prince Edward Island. The headwaters originate in Dundalk, and the river outlets in Port Maitland into Lake Erie. There are four main tributaries to the Grand River: the Speed, Aramosa, Nith, and Conestoga rivers. The watershed has about 1 million residents, with 38 upper and lower tier municipalities and 2 First Nations. About 80% of the population live in the central portion of the watershed, so that includes Guelph, Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge, and Brantford. The predominant land use within our watershed is agriculture, and majority of the watershed population rely on the river and groundwater for their drinking water. The Grand River lies at the heart of one of the richest and fastest growing regions in Ontario. The vitality of the watershed has been linked to the river and the natural environment. The Grand River watershed faces important and evolving challenges. The first major challenge is population growth. The Grand River watershed has a population which is expected to reach 1.4 million in 2041 and 1.8 million by 2066. Municipal drinking water comes from more than 100 wells and 4 river intakes. The same river also receives the treated effluent from 30 sewage treatment plants. More people means more water and more demands on the resources for drinking water, stormwater management, and sewage treatment. Another major challenge is extensive agriculture. The Grand River watershed is one of the richest agricultural regions in Canada, and about 70% of our land is agriculture. Fertilizer, farm chemicals, and animal waste must be stored, handled, and used to minimize the impact on the rivers, stream, and groundwater. Also, erosion needs to be addressed to protect farmland and water quality. A challenge that is facing everyone is climate change. Warmer air and water temperatures, bigger rainstorms, and longer periods of drought. The possible consequences of climate change pose new challenges in managing floods, improving water quality, and securing water supplies for municipalities, farmers, industries, and the natural environment. With these challenges in mind, the GRCA updated our strategic plan in 2019. Our vision is for a healthy watershed where we live, work, play, and prosper in balance with the natural environment. Our mission is to work with local communities to reduce flood damage, provide access to outdoor spaces, share information about the natural environment, and make the watershed more resilient to climate change. Our strategic priorities are to protect life and minimize property damage from flooding and erosion, to improve the health of the Grand River watershed, connecting people to the environment through outdoor experiences, and managing land holdings in a responsible and sustainable way. In order to meet these strategic priorities, the GRCA manages 7 dams and multipurpose reservoirs to actively reduce flood damage and maintain river flows during the summer and fall. This multi-use system also helps to ensure that drinking and wastewater treatment plants can properly operate. Climate change will bring uncertainty in weather, especially extreme events and winter conditions, and our climate monitoring program is being adapted to monitor these changing conditions. GRCA is continuing to work with municipalities in the province to update source protection plans within the Lake Erie region. Currently, the program is funded by the province, and GRCA will continue to push for that. The GRCA is helping to improve watershed health through the administration of the Rural Water Quality Program. This program provides financial and technical assistance to farmers to implement best management practices to improve and protect surface and groundwater quality. Consistent municipal funding has allowed for the development of a positive community attitude to encourage the voluntary adoption of best management practices. In 2019, specifically within the region of Waterloo, 88 projects were completed. In 2018, staff reviewed past projects in the lower Conestoga watershed to evaluate their long-term effectiveness, and I'm happy to report that 96% of the infrastructure projects were still functioning properly, and some of these projects are about 20 years old. Providing people with the opportunity to learn and experience the environment is the best way to build an appreciation of nature and create a sense of stewardship for our watershed. In 2018, 2,000 visitors, mainly children and youth, spend some time connecting with the environment and learning about the watershed at Shade Mills and Laurel Creek Nature Centers. The Nature Centers provided outdoor education to approximately 12,000 students from the various school boards within the region. Community programming on weekends and evenings is also available, as well as our day camps. The GRCA also operates 12 pay-for-use parks throughout the watershed. Specifically to the region, Shade Mills and Laurel Creek conservation areas saw a total of 220,000 visitors from the beginning of the year till they closed in about mid-October this year. The GRCA also has a number of properties within the region that are available for free access to our watershed residents to explore the natural environment. Some of the examples of this in the region are Schneider's Flats and Dumfries in Cambridge. The GRCA owns approximately 48,000 acres of land throughout the watershed, and we need to manage those lands responsibly. With population growth and the demand on our lands, we are looking at better ways to manage our properties and ensure we minimize liability, but still provide great opportunities for our watershed residents. So now I'm going to pass off the presentation to Sonia, and she's going to talk about our draft budget.
So to go through just the arrow?
Yeah.
Through you, Madam Chair, thank you for this opportunity to speak to our budget. I really want to focus on what the challenges are for your GRCA as we work through our 2020 budget. And really, there's two fundamental things we're dealing with. One is we have a lot of uncertainty regarding what the regulations will be that will govern us, specifically speaking to terms like core versus non-core programs and what will be the mandates of conservation authorities into the future. And secondly, during the year, we had 48% of our funding cut back from the Section 39 provincial operating grant. So that was about a $400,000 cut that we have to build into the 2020 budget. In terms of moving forward then, and our core versus non-core programs, in the absence of any specific direction, we'll continue to deliver our programs that are currently in place. We'll continue to fund them in the same methodology that we've used, including the use of our general municipal levy as in the past. And we are anticipating that some new regulations will be brought forth maybe in 2020, and then we're also contemplating that there may be some transitional provisions for implementing them. In terms of a strategy to offset the funding, we set the task of trying not to have to download this to the municipalities, and we came up with 4 sort of strategies to address it, all about an equal weighting in terms of just over 100,000 each. One was to use some reserves to fund some of our capital spending as relates to our dams and our hardware and gauges and those types of items. The second was to tap into, we have hydro generating revenue, and we've had a mandate to put certain amounts of that aside into a reserve, and we said instead we will put additional $50,000 towards funding this other funding shortfall, and also to get some money from our parks as well. We are able to realize some compensation savings. This is not affecting staffing in terms of cutting back FTEs. It's through rate savings triggered primarily through departures, being retirements or voluntary leaves and having different differential rates. And finally, we took a look at some of our discretionary administrative type costs and a few of our operating costs like printing and advertising, and made some cuts there. So in general, we are right now sitting at about a almost $33 million budget, with 80% of it being operating, and then we have capital about 12% and special projects by 7%. You can see this is a reduction from last year, and that's because the budget's a work in progress. You will see that special projects budget probably increasing substantially as we see what projects will flow into next year. And even some capital spending we expect will probably increase. We have some significant dam projects, but we're still assessing our priorities and our timelines on those. So what it results in is an increase to general municipal levy about 2.5%. So we're almost at $12 million. And that translates to the operating increase of 3.8%, and capital levy we decreased by 100,000, and that's because we are using reserves instead of capital levy. And the special projects, it should be noted that we don't rely on general municipal levy at this point to fund those initiatives. So our operating budget translates to just over 26 million, where we're delivering programs in terms of watershed management, managing our dams, our flood forecasting, resource planning, all the regulations that need to be enforced, lands management, our parks, our outdoor education program, communications, and corporate services. Our capital budget's sitting just at about $4 million. That's about 1.8 for the dams and 1.5 for the parks, the big ones there. Our special project sits at 2.4 million, the biggest one there being our source protection program, which continues to be funded by the province 100%. And we've been asked for our submissions for the 2021 year, so we see that as a favorable indicator that they are continuing to be committed to that. And it's also even listed as one of the mandates that conservation authorities should be carrying out. So our revenue is broken down in these various categories, and the municipal levy represents just over 1/3. And this is telling you that the region's levy is slotted to increase by 2%, because even though we are budgeted for 2.5%, based on the apportionment formula, the region's levy is going up by 2%, and so we've just crossed the $6 million threshold between last year and this year. And our per capita levy translates to about $10.97 per person in the watershed, which is just over a million people, and that's up by 13 cents from last year, or about 1.2% increase per capita. And Madam Chair, that is the end of our formal presentation.
And we do have some questions, Sonia, so Councillor Redmond.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm so proud of GRC. Whenever I go to Queen's Park and talk about conservation authorities, I'm always very proud of not only the strides that you make locally, but how well you help neighboring conservation authorities. Specifically, I think it was $48,000 was in there as self-generated in your budget.
48%,
Oh,
yes.
48%?
Of our
Okay.
budget is, almost half our budget is self-generated revenue.
And how much of that would you say, if you can tell me, is sort of cost recovery from services either that you supply other people or for gaining access to our conservation lands that people fish in?
I'd say most of it, excluding we don't allocate, we don't contemplate the sort of typical overhead costs, such like a portion of our CAO or a portion of payroll, but other than that, like our parks are 9 million, and they are, with the exception of the some overhead, they are cost recovery. And we also have a mandate if they have, and they've been recognizing some surpluses, and we protect the surpluses so that we can draw upon them for infrastructure demands or in years of where revenues has a shortfall, so that we don't have to go cutting other programs to make up a park shortfall and try to stabilize that program.
And can you just highlight a little bit the technology, and I'm forgetting the appropriate word for it, but the modeling capability that you have through IT and how you share that?
Yeah, so through you, Madam Chair, I think you're referring to the LiDAR project that we're doing. So LiDAR is similar to sonar, except that it's light and lasers. And so the OMAFRA and MNR funded a project where they went and did LiDAR reading. I think it was across majority of the province, but I'm not 100% sure, but it covered the Grand River watershed. And they did all of the ground surface through funding that we received from the federal government through the National Disaster Mitigation Program. We received funding to actually do the same thing on the ground as they underwater. So as far as we know, we're the first time in Canada that that technology has been used to map the bottoms of the lakes and the streams. So combining both those sets of data, we're in the midst of doing quality control on that, but we're going to be releasing that off of our website so other people can download it as well. But the key thing with this information is that it provides basically a 3D picture of the ground, including underneath the river beds and the streams. So when you're looking at flood mapping, flood mitigation, even looking at simply surface hydrology, the technology has advanced significantly so that it's a better appreciation for how water moves across the topography. So that's where staff are with that right now.
Thank you.
Okay, seeing no other questions. Oh, wait, hang on. Sorry, it's a different color now, so I don't know which one of you is first, to be honest. Okay, there we go. Okay, sorry, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I seem to recall, this is for Sonia, I seem to recall in the context of all the provincial cuts, some discussion by the province about wanting conservation authorities to get back to their core business. Unless I'm making that up, I'm wondering what sort of additional revenues might be achievable for you if you're in fact being limited in the work that you do.
Yeah, go ahead.
Through you, Madam Chair, I can answer that. So in terms of Bill 108, they have further refined what our core mandate is. The minister uses core in the legislation, it's mandatory versus non-mandatory. So the core or the mandatory programs are the ones in which eventually we will be able to levy for. Anything outside of that, we'll have to get into separate agreements with the municipalities to deliver the programs. So it's not necessarily that we have to stop the other programming, it's just there'll be a different way in which to fund those programs.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've got a couple of questions. The first one is on the budget. So our levy is a little below the average, if that's correct. And does that have anything to do at all with the Hamilton situation? Did that cause us to have a lower rate this year, or is it purely and simply on appraised value?
It has nothing to do with the Hamilton situation. It's a continuation of the same formula method we used last year. We are not reverting back to the old formula that we had with Hamilton, and so it's strictly a function of apportionment assessments.
Okay, thanks. The other question I had wasn't so much budget related, more as a matter of interest. So on climate change, which you addressed, Samantha, a couple of times, there's two sides to that coin. Of course, there's the climate adaptation, which is the obvious one for the GRCA to be able to deal with severe weather events and so on. The other side of the coin is decarbonization. So I'm wondering if the GRCA has any formal program within its operations in terms of climate change, in terms of decarbonizing operations, or promoting tree planting and other kinds of activities that decarbonize, and whether or not those are specific to climate change, not for bank stabilization and other, erosion control and so on, but whether or not you have a formal program in that regard.
Through you, Madam Chair. So the predominant reason for the tree planting is for bank stabilization and for reforestation practices, not specifically, I guess, for decarbonization. Is that okay? In terms of our programs at the moment, I don't believe that we have anything dedicated specifically to that. That being said, We are reviewing our environmental policies internally in terms of the operations that the GRCA has ourselves and whether or not we can look at ways to be more efficient and more in tune with managing that side of climate change as well.
Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Galway. Thank you very much, ladies, for coming in today. It's good to see you here, and it's nice that everybody came out with you, so thanks for your presentation. And maybe, Craig, if I can ask you to come up and maybe just give us a reiteration of how their percentage impacts our budget.
Yes, absolutely. So through you, Madam Chair, the Grand River Conservation Authority levy is funded through both the water supply and wastewater treatment budgets. And I believe we had a provision in and around 2.5%. So we have sufficient funding within the proposed water and wastewater operating budgets for the GRC levy for 2020. And with that, and that's the connection, of course, to our main item of discussion today, which is the proposed 2020 user rate budgets. And at this point, I'd like to invite and welcome Nancy Kadusek, our Director of Water Services, to the podium. And Nancy's going to run through in some detail the proposed 2020 user rate budgets.
Thank you, and through to you, Madam Chair. Water Services provides safe drinking water and wastewater treatment to the local municipalities and collection and distribution services to North Dumfries and Wellesley. Water operation is provided by region staff, and wastewater treatment is provided by staff with the Ontario Clean Water Agency. Technical services support the operation and include hydrogeology and source protection, engineering and planning, environmental enforcement and laboratory services, finance and and water efficiency. 53 million cubic meters of water were supplied or projected to be supplied in 2019, and actually that's the same number that we'll be using in 2020 for the user rate. We have over 100 groundwater supply wells and 1 surface water treatment plant, which is the Mannheim Water Treatment Plant. The operating budget for 2020 is proposed to be $34 million, and it's broken down between staffing at 29%, which is approximately $10 million, 20% for utilities, which is $6.8 million, 26% for other expenses like chemicals and maintenance, which is approximately $8.7 million, and fixed costs, which are things like the reserves, the admin costs, and the GRCA, which is $8.5 million. In setting the user rate, we always look to the amount of water that we use in our budget. And the green bars show how much water we have included in our budget for our annual flow. The beige bars show what our actual was, and then for 2019 it shows what we're projecting. Flows for 2020 are projected to be 53 million cubic meters, and as you can see here, the water actuals and the projected water in the budget for 2020 is fairly flat at around that 53 million cubic meters. Our 10-year capital program is at $504 million for water, and it includes $49 million for planning and studies, $62 million for water mains. Our asset management and infrastructure renewal is a total of $193 million, and upgrades, expansions, and new facilities include $195 million. And some of the projects I just wanted to highlight is the work that we're doing in Elmira and St. Jacobs to optimize the distribution system to ensure greater resilience. We're also looking at combining the William and Strange Street water supply system, and by combining those two systems, again, we'll improve flexibility, reliance, and quality in our distribution to Kitchener and Waterloo. And in Cambridge, we're working on the distribution system and working on upgrades as well. Staff worked on various operating programs and efficiency programs with the savings of $632,000 this year for the 2020 budget. One of the key projects was working with the hydro community in participating in their incentive program to reduce the hydro costs. We're also continuing to work at our Mannheim treatment plant on optimizing treatment processes, and we'll actually be working on a pilot with our ozone system in 2020. And we continue to work on our SCADA project, our supervisory control and data acquisition project. And one of the changes that we made there is removing or updating our network system and removing the old bell lines. So that was one change that resulted in some savings as well. This graph here shows the annual, and the bars, it shows the annual consumption of hydro each year. So for 2019, we're projecting to use 41 million kilowatts of energy at a cost of 6.1 million. And each year we work to optimize the energy, try and reduce it. For 2020, we're projecting a cost of approximately 6.8 million in hydro. Some of the program initiatives that we work on are the regulatory compliance to ministry standards. We have over 21 inspections each year, and we bring forward in February, our annual water quality report, and in March, our summary report. For source protection, we also have a requirement now for annual reporting, and we bring forward a report, which is a report on municipal activities, as well as a report on the risk management official activities. And we have been working with asset management on the corporate initiatives of implementing the Lucity work management software this year. And next year, we'll be working on the corporate initiative of the power plant software. And we continue to optimize our capital program. Few water innovations that we've been working on, and I did mention combining systems. So this year we combined the St. Jacobs system, we connected it to Conestoga Plains, and that in turn is connected to the Westmount Road system. We're also looking in the next couple of years to connect the Strange Street and William Street water supply systems. We're working at Mannheim to optimize our treatment and improve the controls that we have there. And we also have a new groundwater education program called I Am Groundwater. So now I'm going to switch over to the wastewater side. In wastewater, the region treated 60 million cubic meters of wastewater. There are 13 wastewater treatment plants in the region, 7 pumping stations, and 1 biosolids facility. Here are the flows. You can see again, the green bars are what we have annually projected in our budget, and the beige bars are what our actual flows have been, with 2019 being a projection. For 2020, our flows will be just under 60 million cubic meters at 59.8, and you can see there again, the wastewater flows have been fairly flat. The wastewater operating budget is proposed at $45 million, and again, the breakdown is 15% in staffing, which is $7 million, 17% in utilities at $7.4 million, other expenses at 16%, which is $7 million. Our aqua contract is 26% at $11.7 million, and our corporate reserve, admin, and GRC costs, again at 26%, $11.8 million. And as you recall, in June of this year, we brought forward a report about our aqua contract. We're in 2020, we'll be in the last year of our 5 years of our aqua contract, and we had a report approved to have a 10-year contract with Aqua going from starting in 2021. The wastewater capital budget is just slightly under 500 million at 493 million. And again, that capital program is broken down into planning and studies at 11 million, asset management and infrastructure projects at 135 million, upgrades and infrastructure and expansion projects at 312 million, and some biosolids work at 33 million. A couple of projects here to highlight is growth-related. We have our Baden, New Hamburg wastewater treatment plant expansion that is ongoing right now, and there's 10 million remaining in that. We also anticipate in the last 5 years of our 10-year program that we'll be expanding the Waterloo wastewater treatment plant. And then we have upgrade work that we have going on at our Hespeler wastewater treatment plant, and some additional work we have going on at Galt and St. Jacobs. And of course, we're continuing to work at the Kitchener wastewater treatment plant. Again, staff worked on various programs to bring forward efficiencies that resulted in savings. In particular, in this case, approximately 1 million. In savings. And one of the programs, again, was the Conservation Initiative through Hydro. This year, we did work for the first half of the year on negotiating the new contract with Aqua. And we have been working on optimizing our biosolids and trying to improve the quality. And this year, we're anticipating that 67% of our biosolids went to reuse, meaning it either went into land application or mine reclamation. Our hydro use here, again, the blue bars show how much hydro was being used annually. We used 41.8 million kilowatt hours of hydro. And the two lines up above, the green line shows what the cost would have been if we had not participated in the incentive program. And the blue line shows what we are anticipating to be charged as a result of participating in the incentive program. So approximately 5.6 million for hydro. Again, a few program initiatives. Wastewater has to comply with both provincial and federal legislation, so we prepare annual and monthly reports both for the province and the federal government. We continue to work on the asset management systems, optimizing our capital program delivery and the corporate initiatives of the Lucity work management system and the Power Plan software. And with wastewater, we have a very high level of treatment to remove nutrients as the wastewater is cleaned and goes back into the river. And so we're optimizing our treatment plant to reduce the nutrients, and we're also continuing to support the rural water quality program. A few wastewater initiatives that we have worked on this year is we've just completed a study in St. Jacobs where we're actually testing and analyzing the various processes to increase capacity of the infrastructure or the throughput of the treatment without building new infrastructure. We have our cogeneration units at Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge are now on site, and they're continuing to work to install them, and will hopefully be on time for commissioning in December 2020 and next year. And at our Hespeler wastewater treatment plant, we're introducing a new technology. It's called MABR. If you want to know the more exciting name, I can tell you. But we applied for a Green Municipal Fund from FCM, and we'll be bringing a report forward on the fact that we did get accepted for funding with that program. And that technology will help us to treat the wastewater, increase the capacity, but at the same time, reducing our reliance on hydro. So the recommended wholesale user rate for water is 1.9, and I just presented a little bit of history on where we are in 2018-19 and proposed for 2020. The wastewater rate for 2020 is proposed to be 3.9. And the total household costs, you can see here, based on a usage of 204 cubic meters annually per year. In 2018, it was 452. It went up to 475. And this year, for 2020, it's proposed to go up to 489, which is an increase of $14. So again, just the recommendation for the wholesale rate is 1.9% for water, 3.9% for wastewater. The cost for water would be $1 at 1.095 per cubic meter, and for wastewater, it would be $1.305 dollars per cubic meter. And with that, I'll go to the retail rate. So on the retail side for water, we're recommending an increase of 4.9% for water with the same flat monthly charge as before, and for wastewater, an increase of 3.9% and the same monthly charge. From 2019 to 2020, the household cost, again based on 204 cubic meters a day or a year, would be $1,281 in 2019, and that would be going to $1,330 in 2020. So the recommended retail rate, based on the increase of 4.9 for water and 3.9 for wastewater, water would be at $3.14 per cubic meter, and wastewater would be at $2.32 per cubic meter. And with that, thank you.
Sorry, don't see any questions, but thank you very much. Oh, hang on. One moment, Councillor Galloway.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Nancy, I think we can be very proud of our wastewater utilities in terms of the product and the infrastructure that we have. I'm curious, though, are there intermunicipal measures like OMBI, or where I'm not sure OMBI's around anymore, but whatever the equivalent is of cost per cubic meter of water, cost of cubic meter water treated, us versus whoever, and is that information available? Have we used those in the past? Or are they apples and oranges, or and how did we compare, I guess?
Yeah, so on the wholesale rate for there are 3 municipalities that are involved with benchmarking, Niagara, York, and the region. And we're in the meeting for cost per water treated, and similarly with wastewater. When we compare with, so when they benchmark them, they benchmark the 2-tier municipality separate from the other municipalities. So we do participate in national benchmarking as well, but when we benchmark there, we benchmark more operational type factors. How many times we've bypassed in a year, how many times have we hit the 90% factor of our water demands. So we benchmark those type of operational parameters. Sorry.
Maybe we could get those benchmark information. Are they available? Like those 3 municipalities and?
Yeah, certainly.
Whatever the benchmarks are, cubic meter of both?
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, so seeing no further questions. Sorry, Thomas.
We'll get those benchmarks, but I think it's important to note that both our water and wastewater systems are very different than those other municipalities. It's, you have one wastewater treatment plant or one big water treatment plant is very different than our system of 13 wastewater treatment plants, over 100 different wells and a surface water treatment plant. So we'll get that information and also provide the commentary on why some of these differences may be what they are.
Thank you for that. Thomas? Okay, so seeing no further questions, Craig?
So thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm just going to conclude the discussion with respect to the user rate budgets with a handful of slides here. I'm just going to move forward. We've got a bunch of information that we've provided in both the budget book, which is available electronically and for, in certain cases, paper versions as well. I have already referenced the information papers that are on today's agenda. So just to reiterate the proposal for user rates for 2020, these rate changes would come into effect on January 1st and are shown on slide 8. And as we indicated last time and discussed, are slightly below the original projections for 2020 from the 2019 year. The average cost per household from a water supply and wastewater treatment perspective is about $14 over the course of the year. In response to a couple of the questions that came up last time, so we had a request for some historical information. Nancy provided a little bit of it. We provided some additional rate summaries going back to 2011. So you can see, on both water and wastewater, but more so on wastewater, rate increases in the 7 and 8% range going back for a number of years now. And slightly lower on the water side, particularly in the last 3 years. And again, with the proposals for 2020. And you can see here what the average household cost is, assuming a constant water consumption of 204 cubic meters per year. We also had a question about reserve balances and rate increases. So we put these next two slides together. Hopefully this provides a good response to the question. And the question was, we have slightly lower rate projections for 2020, and is that somehow going to create a longer-term challenge for us? Are we creating a situation where we may have to come back and have higher than expected increases? And so what we tried to show here, so the lines here represent, and the scale on the right side represent the percentage increase. So on the water supply side, we've adjusted downward the proposed rate increase in 2020 and 2021 only. To 1.9% in each of those years, and then it would go back to 2.9%, which last year's model had originally indicated. And over the course of the 5 years, it actually reflects just a fairly modest difference in terms of the reserve balance when we get to the end of 2024. This is a combined balance, both capital and stabilization reserves. So based on this, we don't see that there's a significant issue created by this lowering of the rate increase, if you will, in 2020 and 2021. And then similarly on the wastewater side, what's being proposed is actually just a 1-year reduction. So 2020 is 1% lower than originally contemplated, and then that would go back to a 4.9% for the next couple of years before dropping back to 3.9 after that. This has a slightly larger percentage impact as we head out to 2024, but I think overall still gives us a reasonable amount of reserves on the wastewater side, which suggests to us that we're not creating a situation, and of course all other things being equal, where we would have to come back and say, okay, we undershot it significantly in 2020, we have to have a much higher increase going forward.
Okay, Councillor Galloway.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this is the information that I might have been asking for, or at least part of it. because some of us lived through a period of time, if you go back enough years, where we allowed our reserves to go too low, and then we had a lot of catch-up to do. And it was fairly painful, 10, 12% increases to some of the utilities on an annual basis. So I just want to protect against us falling into that again. I think all of us probably like to have the rates smooth as much as possible. And when if you go back to the slide previous, one
more?
One more. You know, that's not exactly smooth. It's not as bad as it was if we go back even a few more years, but and I'm not trying to get the rates higher. That's not the objective. I just want to make sure that we all realize that we don't want to get into that kind of situation. And I'm concerned about, the cost of money is low. The cost of money may not be so low in the future. I don't know what assumptions you've made in regards to borrowing costs down the road. They're certainly very favorable now, may not be so favorable. Are we hedging for that? I'm not actually asking the questions. I'm just trying to make sure that all that's been taken into consideration in establishing these rates, and we aren't going to have a situation where 2, 3 years, 4 years from now, whatever, we need 10 and 12% increases to replenish reserve funds.
So through Madam Chair, so notwithstanding that there wasn't a specific question there, I'd still like to respond, and I would say, first of all, some of the items, or most of the items that you've hit on, I would say are all items that we regularly discuss as we go through the budget process in each year. So for example, the cost of borrowing, quite low right now, still near historical levels. When we do our modeling, we assume an interest rate that's somewhat higher than the rates that are in place right now. Whether that will stay that way over the course of the next 10 years is hard to say, but we've tried to we've tried to be both realistic and, trying to find that balance between being as realistic and as possible, but also having a bit of conservatism built into the models. I think you'll see as I go through, I think the next couple of slides as I touch on capital, because I can't get through a budget presentation without talking about capital and the funding of capital. You're going to see that on water and wastewater, we believe that we're in a very good position from a non-growth perspective. So leaving aside the development charge growth component, the portion of the capital program that we actually fund from the user rates, we would say is in very good shape from a funding perspective. So that's another test that we would look to. If we were presenting a water and wastewater budget that had a significant amount of non-growth related debt, that might tell us that our contributions to fund capital are not nearly where they should be, and we shouldn't be in a position of lowering rates. In fact, we should be increasing rates in order to generate that kind of funding. But you're going to see as we go through the funding side that we don't believe that that's an issue. So I think on balance, staff are comfortable with the recommended rates that we are proposing for 2020.
Thank you for that, Craig. So seeing no other business, I would look to the group for a motion to adjourn the meeting. Councillor Foxton? Councillor?
Oh,
Sorry?
Oh, we still have a fair bit to go through, Madam Chair. I'm sorry.
Okay. Sorry, my mistake. I was looking at this and going,
That's okay.
What are we going to go out and go back in? So I'll leave it to you then to carry on.
Thank you. Thank you. So, just to conclude, the conversation for water and wastewater rates for today. So again, just flipping over to the capital funding side. So, the key message I would say on capital and the item that is of most concern to staff is on growth-related funding and financing. So, the growth-related portion of our capital program that we fund from development charges is the area that is concerning us most. And on this slide, so this is looking at the $500 million capital program for water over the next 10 years. You look on the left-hand side, this is the user rate portion, what we call the non-growth portion that we fund from user rates. We have almost all of it funded through the actual user rate collections themselves and the contributions we make to capital, what we refer to as pay-as-you-go, a very small amount of debt, and I think on the water side specific to one particular project that we're looking at over the next 10 years. It's a different story on the development charge side, on the growth-related side, where we have a fairly significant amount of growth-related debt to issue over the next while. And you recall the conversation we had 2 weeks ago about Bill 108 and the impacts on development charge collections and the availability of development charge funding. Because this is then what we end up with from a debt outstanding perspective. So the really good news is in the first two columns. This is saying that we're almost, at this point, debt-free on water, both growth and non-growth. There's a very small piece left that will be paid off in full in 2021. But what we see happening over the next 4 or 5 years is the introduction of growth-related debt. And this is basically reflecting our capital expenditures in the early part of the capital program relative to the development charges that we have available to fund that work. And where we don't have the development charges available, we're in a situation of needing to issue debt. And this would suggest that we're going to add, between $40 and $50 million of debt over the next 4 years. So this is, I would say, on both the water side, you're going to see this repeated on the wastewater side, the area where we're spending our most attention as we move forward to make sure that we're issuing, I would say, an appropriate amount of debt. And once I get through the wastewater side, I'll just explain briefly the risks that we're trying to avoid. So on wastewater treatment, also approximately $500 million of capital spending. Very good shape, again, on the user rate side, just a very small amount of non-growth debt planned over the next 10 years, but again, a relatively significant amount on the development charge side. And again, that's the area that we are focusing on. The wastewater debt profile, very different from water. We've issued a significant amount of wastewater-related debt over the last few years. I would say generally quite appropriately for the types of projects that we've been undertaking. It's a combination of both development charge and user rate funded debt. And so what we're seeing here is over the next 4 or 5 years, we have additional growth-related debt that we're anticipating over the next 4 or 5 years. So the mix of debt is changing, and we're getting an increasing amount of debt that has to be supported by future development charges on the wastewater side. And these are the risks. This is the key message. This is what we're trying to manage and mitigate as we go forward. We want to avoid a situation where we have an over-reliance on growth-related debt. Because what happens is we have then a fixed amount of debt servicing costs that we can't alter. Right? When we issue debt, we're basically entering into a contract to say this amount of interest and principal is going to be paid over the next 10, 15, 20 years. But we're funding that fixed amount from, I don't know if volatile is the right word, a fluctuating, maybe difficult to predict level of development charges. And our concern, if, for example, we were to head into a period of an economic downturn, that the development charges that we would collect wouldn't be sufficient to fund those growth-related debt servicing costs. And that's why we're so careful and conscious of the amount of growth-related debt that we're issuing. And so one of our measures is we look at how do our debt servicing costs compare to our collections? And that's what we tried to show here on the right-hand side of slide 17. So the bottom line is water. So what we're comparing here is is the percentage of our collections that is, I'll say, accounted for or consumed is the wrong word. There's a word I'm looking for. Committed, thank you. The percentage of collections that is committed in order to fund existing debt servicing costs. In water, it's 0 right now because we have no growth-related debt. But as we issue that debt, we're projecting this percentage over the next 10 years is going to exceed 30%, meaning 30% of whatever we collect needs to be funded from, 30% of what we collect is going to be used to fund debt servicing costs. It's more significant on the wastewater side because we've issued so much growth-related debt already. The first $8 to $9 million of DC collections on the wastewater side go to pay existing debt servicing costs. And that's the real risk to us. It stays relatively constant over the forecast, but okay, from a regional treasurer's perspective, it's at too high a level, right? So ideally, we'd want to see, I think, those numbers stay, say, 20% or below, maybe 25 at the most, probably not at 50. So it's just indicative of the risk that we're trying to manage. And it's particularly challenging on water and wastewater, where the infrastructure has to be in place before the actual development occurs. And so we tend to find in other municipalities as well that a significant amount of debt is issued on the water and wastewater side.
Okay, Craig, for just a second, please, if you'll indulge us. Councilor Redmond.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Craig, is it fair to assume that part of this uncertainty really is the change in how we are able to collect development charges?
That is absolutely one of the, that's probably the key factor that we have here. So we discussed last week the implications of Bill 108 and both the calculation of the development charge at an earlier point in the process, as well as the deferred payment arrangements for certain types of development, is probably the most significant factor that we're facing here. And notwithstanding, the recent proposed amendments through Bill 138 on commercial and industrial, it's still an issue for us based on the timing of the calculation and then deferred payments for a number of different types of development. So that is absolutely one of the issues we're trying to still work with.
Because I think that's a really significant thing to remind ourselves of at this juncture. And is it also fair to say that because this investment's made up front, that there could be a point in time where a future council might decide to put off the construction of infrastructure, which might in actuality slow down expansion or construction because of the sort of debt that we're bearing bringing those DCs in over 6 years?
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair, I would say that's definitely an option for councils in the future. We've tried to set out a number of potential actions that could be taken. One of them is delaying or deferring the construction of infrastructure. Because at some point, this level of risk, from a staff perspective, this level of risk is going to be, is just going to get too high, and we're going to come to you and say, well, we have significant plant expansions that need to happen if growth is going to continue in the region. Here's where they're happening, as Mr. Schmidt and Nancy indicated earlier. We have 13 wastewater treatment plants. And so determining when expansions will happen at each of those plants, it could become a significant issue at some point in the future if the funding is not there and if our level of debt servicing costs hits, I'll say, an unmanageable level.
And to me, it's just a cautionary tale because it's exactly a perverse result of what the province stated their intention was, which actually was to expand. But this level of risk and this level of debt being borne over a longer period of time is definitely something that we worry about. As you mentioned, our AAA rating, they do look at those ratios, correct?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Councillor Galway.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to pursue that a little bit further, the point that Chair Redmond has raised. First of all, on the growth side with the RDCs, can it pay for quality projects or just capacity projects? Or can it pay for both?
It can pay for both.
Does the
It can pay for both because we can relate quality to expansion within the plant.
So if we wanted to just upgrade on a quality basis, but with no new capacity, one of the 13 plants, we could use development charges to do it.
Yes, but not to the complete extent. So I think there's an example of where we would have both a growth and a non-growth share for that kind of project.
Okay. Well,
Essentially what happens if you had a wastewater treatment plant and just for want of a number, say it was 1,000 cubic meters of capacity and we were using 500 of it, if you did a quality expansion, 50% of the cost would be to the user rate, 50% of the cost would be to the development charge because we're maintaining the ability to use that extra capacity. If we did not do the quality expansion, we would not be able to use that capacity. But basically, that's the ratio that would use. It's whatever percentage of the plant is remaining, you would apply that percentage to the cost for quality improvement.
and sometimes the quality improvements are mandated by the province as well. And they don't necessarily give us any revenue to do that, but yet they take away our development charge collection ability and put on new requirements for quality. And then, of course, we have the capacity issues, which are somewhat self-generated. And that's what I wanted to pursue with what Chair Redmond was talking about. So on the capacity side, you know, to some extent, you're chasing your tail to a certain extent, because if you slow down capacity and stunt development, then you're stunting collections, even though the collections aren't enough to carry the capacity improvements. Are we, and I don't know if this is for you or for Mr. Rogier, are we actually able to say, no, we're not going to service that subdivision? We just don't have the money in the reserve fund, and you developers don't want to pay development charges, so therefore we're just going to have to hold off on that for 10 years until we have the money in the reserve fund to build the capacity that's needed to service that particular development. I'm not sure who is.
Well, I'll start, and then you know, Craig may want to comment from a finance perspective. Rod may want to comment from a you know, planning and growth management perspective. So it's more than a hypothetical scenario. Like, we could get to a point with one or more of our wastewater treatment plants in particular. We could get to a point with one or more of our wastewater treatment plants where we basically use up the capacity. And then we would not have the ability to approve additional development within the catchment area of that plant. We could be approving development in many other parts of the region. And, you know, to your point about sort of chasing your tail, we would still have ample capacity for growth in 12 of 13 catchment areas. So there'd be lots of places for people to build and buy new houses or infill or intensification. So there'd be lots of opportunity for growth and development, lots of opportunity for collecting development charges, but it might not be happening in the catchment area of one particular wastewater treatment plant. And if we didn't have capacity and we didn't have an imminent plan to expand that plant, we would need to not approve any additional development in that catchment area. And in the past, the region has been in that situation within the catchment area of various wastewater treatment plants.
Yeah, I think that happened in air at one point in time, where we had to hold up certain developments until capacity was increased. That was really just a timing issue. It wasn't so much a financing issue. But I guess I'm maybe being devil's advocate here to some extent. If the government wants to do this to us and benefit the development industry accordingly, then is there some consequences, unintended consequences? Because we can't necessarily be expected to just backfill all this capital cost that we might otherwise have collected, or some of which we would otherwise have collected through development charges.
So I would say
So this is some real rubber hits the road stuff.
that's absolutely a valid analysis, absolutely. And the backstop that I think Craig really pointed out in this slide is, by us incurring debt to expand the wastewater treatment plants, we're also taking on all that risk. That development is going to continue to proceed as projected, and if it doesn't proceed as projected, we're still holding that debt that we've got to pay every year, whether or not we get the development charge collections to actually offset that cost. So that for sure is an impact of some of the recent provincial changes, is that undoubtedly we will take on more risk if we're going to continue to build infrastructure and continue to allow growth and development to proceed, in most parts of the region.
I guess all I'm really trying to say is that, this is great information, and we're going to go ahead, obviously, with what we're planning to do. But it's not a bad message to permeate through the development industry. You guys lobbied against development charges. You guys got your way. So, we're looking at 10 and whatever years down the road, we could be hitting a wall at some point in time that you're not going to like us hitting. Maybe not a bad message to get out there.
Yeah, and so I think it's a really good point. Two other comments come to mind. One is we had this conversation, I'm trying to think now whether it was a year ago or maybe 18 months ago, when a proposal was being floated around to prevent municipalities from imposing a water and wastewater development charge. A thought that was being circulated quite prominently through the provincial government ranks at that time, and that was absolutely one of the arguments that we made, that it's a hugely important funding mechanism for municipalities to put infrastructure in place, and in the absence of that revenue source, then there's a fairly small number of choices, one of which is to not put the infrastructure in place, which then has the corresponding impact on development. We've also been talking about it ever since the first reading of Bill 108 back in the spring of this year, and what at that time was a significant impact to development charge collections over the next 5 years. And we've had, I think, a number of conversations at a staff level about a range of potential responses, which is anything from attempting to increase the development charge to deferring projects to looking at front-ending agreements. There's a number of different approaches we could take in order to help us mitigate this risk.
I might add, through you, Chair Jowett, that we are also in the process of reviewing the regional official plan, and that review process does take into consideration the sanitary and water capacity as we currently have it and as projected. So there needs to be a close linkage between our plans to accommodate future growth and capacity, and that needs to be reflected in our regional official plan as well.
Thank you for that. Sandy. Sorry, Councillor Shantz.
Thank you. That discussion was really helpful to try to connect some of the dots that I was trying to figure out what the dots even were in my head. But one question I still have, is our growth, I believe it's provincially mandated, isn't it, our rate of growth? Is that true?
Through you, Chair Jowett, the province has mandated a rate of growth that we are planning for, and of course, market realities are another factor that dictate our actual growth rate.
So what if we don't meet the provincial objectives for rate of growth?
Well, historically, we've been pretty close. The variations have been relatively minor, I think we have a fairly significant level of confidence that we'll be within, an error margin of the provincial growth rates.
And is that because of our DC charges that we can do that?
Well, I think that there are a variety of factors, including the sophistication of our demographic models, and those of the province. The province attempts to forecast growth based on demography and economic trends and so on. Our DC rates, I don't think, are playing that much of a role in the overall growth pattern or growth rate in the region.
Okay, thank you.
So can I just make a quick observation? When Councillor Galloway was speaking to perhaps sending some clear messaging out to our development community, suggesting that we'd be maybe pushing back the opportunity to help with development in the infrastructure. And then I look at the housing shortage that we have and the already, ever-existing homeless crisis, and then the 8,000 people that are sort of slated to perhaps be vulnerable to that. Would those kinds of expressions actually set us back in that way? I mean, it's ultimately passed on to the homeowner and the rentor, from what I understand anyway. The developers are not absorbing those costs. So are we concerned about that at all?
Through Madam Chair. So I think, if I think back to the process that we just went through in terms of updating our development charge background study, we had a fair bit of discussion, conversation, liaison with the local development community. I think there's an opportunity to continue that conversation as we go forward. One of the immediate next steps will take place at Administration Finance Committee next week. So we have a report that will come out on that agenda with respect to Bill 138 and some recommendations for Council to consider for further amendments to that legislation. And depending on where that ends up, I think then we would be in a position, once we have a little bit of certainty about what's going to happen, then I think a conversation with the home builders starting early in the new year, just to, basically to continue the dialogue that started over the first 6 months of this year through the background study, would be worthwhile to continue as we head into 2020.
Much appreciated. Okay, so I guess you can continue, it looks like.
Okay, so just to conclude on the user rate budgets. So again, rate adjustments proposed for January 1st are lower than the projections from last year. We believe that we're sufficiently funded on the non-growth side of capital, and growth-related debt continues to be probably our most significant challenge from a budget perspective. And again, the user rate budget approval is planned for December the 11th. So I would say if there's any additional information that members of committee are looking for, anything else that would be helpful in terms of your deliberations in a couple of weeks that would lead to approval of the 2020 user rate budgets, please let me know, get in touch with staff, and we'll do our best to bring that information forward next time, which again is in a couple of weeks, and those rate adjustments would take effect on January the 1st. So I'm not sure, Madam Chair, we're going to switch gears a bit and go into the tax-supported budget, whether you want me to just continue, whether you wanted to take a short break at this point, we're in your hands.
Well, thank God for that. I'd like to take a break if we could. I much appreciate the suggestion. Thanks, Greg. So we'll take a 5-minute 10 minutes? Yeah.
What's that mean?
All right, Craig, take it away.
Okay, so thank you, Madam Chair. So we're going to switch gears now and talk about the tax-supported budget. There are a few things we're going to go through. A little bit of reminder of some of the things we talked about a couple of weeks ago, but not too much. We're going to talk about the capital program kind of in the same way that we just discussed water and wastewater, and with a bit of focus in this case on both asset renewal and growth-related capital. We have some additional information on each of the budget issue papers. You may recall we have a relatively small list, so we're going to go through each of those. User fees and charges, there's a couple of councillor requests that are thrown in here. And actually, now that I look at it, the one thing that's missing from this slide is we have a brief presentation from Steve Vandekeer. Steve's going to run through a handful of slides with respect to the roads capital program, and we'll get there in the next little bit. And then we'll talk about next steps, and then that'll take us into the public meeting later on this evening. So status. So this is generally unchanged, maybe completely unchanged from last time. So we had a guideline approved for 2020 at 2.5%. We're basically at just slightly above that level right now. Assessment growth has been finalized. We presented 1.77% as an estimate 2 weeks ago. That number is now finalized. So that is our assessment growth in 2019 for the 2020 budget. So a little bit lower than the last couple of years, but in excess of the 3 or 4 or 5 years before that. We had a request for some information about staff complement. So this table is right out of today's staff report. So there's a couple of things I just want to touch on here. First of all, as we went through and prepared our base budgets, staff identified a total of 8 FTE reductions over through that process. So those have been incorporated into the base budgets. The other item, which I don't think I circled here, if you go up about the 4th line down, those council-approved reductions in 2019. So you may recall that we had brought a report forward, I think it might have been in June, sometime over the summer, where a number of budget issue papers that had been previously approved, we'd made a decision to hold off on those. In light of funding changes from the province. So that resulted in a 7 FTE reduction, which is then built into our adjusted complement for 2019, and then the further 8 positions that were removed as part of our base budget development process this year. One of the requests was for a little bit of history on staff complements. So we've gone back, we've shown 5 years worth of history in terms of the change in staff complement. So there's a couple of interesting things, actually maybe one interesting thing to note here. So if you compare the end, so we show the actual number of FTEs and then the year over year change. Ranges 55, 13, 77, 71. And then one of the points that I think we've made over the last couple of years is that service expansion at the region through budget issue papers has been largely focused in 3 areas over the last 5 years. Implementation of additional service hours in GRT, additional resources and vehicles for paramedic services, and staff resources at Sunnyside Home. And so that's what the next line shows. You can see the proportion of the change related to those 3 areas. The point here is that the vast majority of the staffing additions over the last 5 years at the region have been in those 3 areas: GRT, paramedic services, and Sunnyside. In a couple of circumstances, 2016 and 2019, on the surface, the numbers actually appear to not make sense, but that's only because we had reductions in other areas, okay? Overall, again, I think it makes the point that that's where service expansion predominantly has been at the region. That is no different in the 2020 budget. And we'll see that as we go through the issue papers. So I hope that's a helpful piece of information. This one I'll affectionately refer to as my Tom Galloway slide. Councillor Galloway, this follows the little history lesson that we had last time about education taxes. And Councillor Galloway's point was about the overall level of education taxes on the residential side. And so we put this chart together, which I think proves exactly the point that you were making at the time. So the blue line here, the one that's increasing as you go from left to right, is the CVA, so the current value assessment, the average value of a residential property on a steady incline. The red line, the one that goes down as you go from left to right, is the provincially established residential education tax rate, which is one rate across the entire province. And that rate comes down. And the point is that the province, I think quite deliberately, certainly through the over the last 10 years, as property values have increased, the residential education tax rate has dropped in order to generate approximately the same number of taxes, same amount of taxes. And that's generally what we're seeing. It varies between municipalities. We provided the data points here so you can see it. And if you look at the bottom, the average education taxes paid, you can see it does fluctuate year to year. Went up from in 2011 and in 2012, stayed about the same in 2013, has been on a bit of a downhill run since then. And this will vary across the province. This is a reflection of how property values in Waterloo region have changed relative to property values across the province. But I think exactly proves the point that Councillor Galloway was making 2 weeks ago.
And if you'll just hold for a moment, I think he'd like to make it again.
No, sorry. I guess the relevance of this is really not to our advantage, actually, because when you get a homeowner asking you and complaining to you about their property taxes, of course, they're always talking about the entire bill. They probably do not know the relationship between education, upper tier, lower tier taxes, and so the rate of property taxes, the increase is really only at the municipal level. We can't claim, well, it's your education taxes that are going up. That's what's causing the increase. In fact, your education taxes are coming down slightly. Now, it's my understanding, and certainly we are not doing this, but there are some municipalities that actually backfill this, or at least see this as an opportunity to backfill. So I'm not sure that's what the government wants, but and I'm not suggesting any of our 7 local municipalities are backfilling either, but this could be tempting on some people's part.
Okay, just a brief reminder of some of the significant base budget pressures. We talked last time about the annualization of service enhancements that were approved in 2019 and need to be annualized into 2020. We have development charge, the funding of discretionary development charge exemptions, a variety of service contracts and winter maintenance, asset maintenance and renewal. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. And then, of course, this is the final year of the Stage 1 Rapid Transit funding strategy. Just a reminder on discretionary RDC exemptions, which we've estimated to be in the range of $15 million a year. We have just under $5 million sitting in the 2019 budget. Council approved in principle a couple of meetings ago incremental budget adjustments on both the user rate and tax levy side. And the figures for 2020 shown here have been reflected or are reflected in the base budgets for both water, wastewater, and on the property tax side as well. We had a request for some additional information regarding discretionary benefits. So this slide provides at a fairly high level the various expenditure categories. Totals 4.6 million was the budget in 2019, unchanged in 2020. And that 4.6 million is funded in part by the province of Ontario, about $2.8 million, and an additional 1.8 million is funded from regional property taxes. And the provincial subsidy portion is based on, I believe, $10 per case per month for both Ontario Works and ODSP caseload. We also had some discussion last time about the use of the tax stabilization reserve. So we wanted to follow up and just provide an overview of the various uses of the tax stabilization reserve in the proposed 2020 budget. It totals about $2.5 million. And relates to a few different things. We've talked previously about how we've used the tax stabilization reserve to basically phase in the levy impact of paramedic services expansions. So we see that here from the 2019 budget issue paper, the proposed budget issue paper in 2020. We have winter maintenance, which is the winter maintenance pilot for $600,000. We have a portion of the region's contribution to the SWIFT project. And on the capital side, we have a $1 million project in for renovations for the consumption and treatment services site. For the moment, we have that identified as 50% funded by the province, 50% by the tax stabilization reserve. Staff are still working with the province in order to finalize those numbers. So that figure could change between now and budget approval in January. But overall, about $2.5 million proposed to be used in 2020. And so just in terms of to give that some context, the tax stabilization reserve has a target balance of 15 million and has been at that level for the last 2 years. So we would say that the allocation from the TSR at 2.5 million is reasonable given the overall balance in that reserve. And most importantly, we would say that each of those items on that previous page has an exit strategy. It's temporary, it's either one time or it's over 1 or 2 years, but in each case, we know how we get out of it and we get out of it fairly quickly. And that suggests that those are appropriate uses of the tax stabilization reserve. So with that, we're going to turn to budget issue papers, which we talked about a little bit last time. We'll go through in a little bit more detail now. They total about $2 million in 2020. And so you can see that in the first column of numbers here, about just over $2 million. Annualization into 2021 is at $857,000. So if all these issue papers were approved as presented and we fast forwarded a year, I would be showing you that $857,000 number as one of the items in the 2021 base budget as we annualize each of those budget issue papers, were that to happen. So I'm just going to quickly go through each of them and happy to take questions as we go, Madam Chair. I'm going to start with transit. The first is improved frequency on the Wilmot transit service line, Route 77. Has an annualized cost of about $177,000 with $59,000 would be added to the 2020 budget if it was approved. With respect to the Mobility Plus business plan, we have additional service hours planned for the urban areas commencing in September of 2020. Has an annualized cost of $200,000. $144,000 would be in the 2020 budget. Again, if approved, that cost would be area rated to the properties within the 3 cities. Now, with respect to GRT service enhancements and expansion, I need to go back to 2019. So there's just a little bit of a story here. I just want to make sure is clear. In the 2019 budget, we had, similar to what we have this year, we had a couple of different bundles. One of them was for 25,000 service hours, and that bundle was approved and came into effect on September 1st of 2019. So that was the first approval. We then had a report back in May, and you'll recall the conversations we had about the Conestoga College UPass about a year ago as those changes were happening. Council approved in May service expansion to Conestoga College to start also on September 1st, 2019. That was another 13,000 service hours. So that's in the 2019 budget as of September 1st, and then of course gets annualized into 2020. The other thing that happened was council had approved the second bundle to come into effect on April 1st, 2020. So this was a 2019 approval of 10,000 service hours to come into effect on April 1st of 2020. And so that service enhancement has been built into the base budget effective April the 1st. And that has a cost of about $650,000, again, reflected in the budget that's been presented. And so I thought this table might be helpful, because this shows how the GRT business plan has been implemented since 2018. So in 2018, 35,000 hours added as of September the 1st. In 2019, we had Bundle 1 and Conestoga College, effective September 1st. That's about 38,000 hours added. And then for 2020, we have the second bundle from 2019 coming into effect on April the 1st, 10,000 hours, and a proposal for an additional 15,000 hours, which is Bundle 1 from the new budget issue paper planned for 2020 as of September the 1st. So I think, thinking back a couple of weeks, I'm not sure we were as clear as we could have been on this, and hopefully this table clarifies what's happened over the last couple of years and what's being proposed for 2020. So again, the 2019 Bundle 2 is already reflected in the base budget. The Bundle 1 from 2020 would need approval from council in order to be included in the budget and would come into effect on September the 1st.
Okay,
I think there's a question from Councillor Galloway.
sorry about that. Councillor Galway?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Craig, this is really helpful, and I had forgotten about the April 1st one too. So for 2020, so that's good. But was there a reason why the LRT doesn't show up on here? I mean, we introduced a whole lot of new service within the GRT family on June the 21st. So would it not be worth mentioning that? And then at that time, did we not also increase conventional bus service?
So through you, Madam Chair, I believe what we did right around that time was a reallocation, a reconfiguration, if you will, of the network. Not sure whether any service hours were added. I'll look to Mr. Schmidt to help me out.
I don't believe we added any service hours, but once the ION was started, all of the hours that had been on bus routes along that corridor were reallocated to other locations within the region, primarily to I-Express type routes along Ottawa Street and others.
So when we talk about the 50,000 hours, what are we talking about?
Those are hours that would have been replaced by ION. And we took those and reallocated them to make the necessary changes and increase level of service throughout the system.
Yeah, and I don't think we should lose sight of that. The reallocated hours, they were already budgeted and being paid for, but more importantly, I think the LRT should show up on here somewhere too, because if you want a complete picture of GRT, which ION is part of, there's quite a few thousand hours of service there.
Absolutely.
Cost of $45 million a year.
So we can absolutely add it. I would say the only reason it's not there is because I was trying to relate it back to the business plan implementation, and just to give a frame of reference for that 35,000 hours. That's the only reason it's not there. It's an easy addition, and we'll do that.
It's not a criticism, I just think.
It's a really good
As
point.
we deal with this going forward, it's good to have all the hours on one page.
Absolutely. We'll do that and show it next time.
Councillor Armstrong?
On Route 77, you see the expansion of more frequency, but does it expand the number of times that we're making runs, expend the hours beyond what's there now? Like, do we go further into the evening or over the lunch hour, or on the weekend as well?
My understanding is that this would increase the frequency, so we would move from 75 minutes to 45 minutes. But I don't believe that it changes the hours of service.
Because I think that's something that we've been looking for because of the inconvenience of the hours as they are. Somebody goes to, had somebody attend something in the morning, and he had to take the bus home, and he had to go and sit at the boardwalk for 3 hours to wait for the afternoon bus. He missed the late bus in the morning, and he had to sit for a couple of hours at the boardwalk. And I think that's something that we need to correct, and also later into the evening. I mean, the last bus runs at 7, and there's people that are in the city until later, so that's something we've been trying to target. And I think maybe there should be maybe a survey done to talk to the people about when they would like the frequency, because there's more and more people using it to go to college, go to Conestoga and to the universities. So I think that's part of the riderships. I mean, it's really effective, and you know, at this point, it's not going to affect the budget that much because it comes out of the money we give you from the township. Yeah.
So, Madam Chair, I believe Mr. Schmidt's interpretation is correct. A quick read of the issue paper suggests that it's frequency. There's no reference to extending hours, but we'll absolutely confirm that and bring that information back.
I'd appreciate that. Look at the expanding the hours.
And Chair Redmond?
Thank you. I just would really like to voice my support for the implementation of the Mobility Plus 5-year business plan. This plan, from the way I read it, offers about 6,000 more trips for people who need Mobility Plus, as well as looking at reviewing their business plan and looking how they can better integrate with the GRT service. And I know this community feels they've been underserved, and you can see by the performance that year to date in 2019, there's over 13,000 trips that have not been answered. So I think being strategic in how we plan on going forward, plus offering additional services, really a great direction to go in this service. So thank you.
Councillor Lorenz?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just on that issue, it says that the costs are area rated to the 3 cities. So is all of Mobility Plus area rated? If the service expands in any of the townships, that's area rated?
Yep. So through Madam Chair, so there's area rating of mobility services within the 3 cities and within the 4 townships. So a service enhancement within the 3 cities is funded by properties in those cities and similarly in the townships.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, all clear.
Okay, we'll just get caught up here. Give me a moment. Okay, so then just finishing off the conversation with respect to the GRT business plan, we have an issue paper that has 3 identified and separately costed bundles. 2 bundles of 15,000 hours, and then a third bundle of 5,000 hours. Bundle 1 is recommended to be included within the overall budget and is within that 2.58% figure that we started out with. And you can see this is the table showing the cost, so it would add about $1 million to the budget in 2020 with a relatively small annualization heading into 2021. On the housing side, we have an issue paper relating to resources for the implementation of the recently approved Waterloo Region Housing Master Plan. So consistent with the report that came forward, there are 4 positions proposed, 2 within housing, 2 on the facilities side. The facilities positions are recovered and funded through the capital projects, and the 2 on the housing side would be funded from the levy, about $100,000 in 2020. These are assumed to be approximately July 1st hires, and so we would have an annualization of another $100,000 in 2021. Senior services, this goes back to our my original slide about staff complement. So we've talked about transit. With respect to Sunnyside, we have additional request for personal support worker hours at Sunnyside Home. It's approximately about 2.5 FTEs at an overall cost of just under $200,000. If approved, this additional service would come into effect on or about April 1st of 2020. We also have an issue paper with respect to substance use and harm reduction. This was the topic of a recent staff report back in October, and has an overall cost of $122,000. We have assumed for the purposes of this issue paper that the expenditure, which is in the can't remember the exact number, say $400,000 range, would be funded 70% by the province, and so what we're showing here is the net cost of $122,000, and this would come into effect in early 2020.
One moment, please. Councillor Clark?
Thanks, Chair. With regards to the Sunnyside PSWs, am I remembering correctly that we either had or were faced with a provincial cut related to extra funding for high needs? I know I'm not getting the words right. Is this due to that cut, or is it unrelated? And sorry, Connie's eating.
Okay, through you, Madam Chair. That was a high wage transition fund.
Oh,
that was, I guess, delayed for another year, so we really don't know what the status is going to be, but no, this is not related to that directly.
Thank you.
Carry on.
Okay, and then finally, we have the implementation of the Paramedic Services Master Plan. And there are 2 options that have been costed, a 2 12-hour ambulance shift option and a 5 12-hour ambulance option. Option 1 being the 2 12-hour ambulances is recommended. It would have a cost of $433,000 in 2020, annualized to just under $800,000. So a couple of pieces to this. One is we have assumed that the province will continue to fund service expansion as they have in the past. The indication we have so far, we had, you may recall, despite the initial call for a reduction or a freezing in funding initially, we actually had an increase in funding in 2019 and some indication that further growth in ambulance funding would happen in 2020. So we have costed this, excuse me, on the basis that the provincial funding model for ambulance expansion will continue. And because that subsidy always lags behind a year, we're continuing to propose to use the tax stabilization reserve to basically phase in the levy impact over 3 budget years.
Right, one moment, please. Craig? Mayor Redmond?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess we're a little slow at our switches these, because this is actually a question about the substance use and harm reduction. and it's probably a question for Dr. Wang. I'm just wondering, do we have any sense of when we will know what the apportionment of funding is going to be? Have they given any indication when we might find that out? Anne's shaking her head.
So generally speaking, our provincial submissions go in at the end of March, and they are then dealt with by the province. And typically, we wouldn't hear back from the province until the summer as to whether costs were, or expansions were going to be cost shared or not.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to talk just for a little bit about the tax-supported capital program.
Sorry, Craig. Councillor Galloway?
Yeah, back on paramedic services, Craig. So option one is being recommended. It's being recommended to get the 433 out of tax stabilization.
Through you, Madam Chair. So the 433 is the levy impact.
Oh, that's the levy impact.
That's the levy impact, yep.
And so there's an equal amount of money coming out of the tax stabilization fund?
Yes, that's correct. So the estimated expenditures are about $867,000, 50-50 split, assumed will come into effect on or about July 1st.
So if council were to take option two, it would be the same. You would recommend, if we were to, if council was to take option two, you would recommend $1,043,000 coming out of tax stabilization and $1,043,000 coming from the levy?
That's correct.
So it would be the same recommendation.
We have,
Whatever
excuse,
the 50% is would come out of tax stabilization as we have in the past.
That's correct.
It's not a, okay.
Yes, and so further to that point, on the previous slide about tax stabilization reserve funding, so that would add another, if that's where we ended up, that would say add another 600,000 or so and bring the total TSR funding to a bit over 3 million. Okay, excuse me, on the tax-supported budget, we have a 10-year investment plan of about $3.5 billion covering roads, public transit facilities, waste, paramedic, airport, cultural services. I want to talk about both asset renewal and about growth. And in both cases, the approach that we're taking with respect to the funding and how we're trying to manage that risk. So we have, as we've talked about before, a significant number of assets in place right now. We need to plan for the renewal and refurbishment and replacement of those assets. We're working towards and are very close to full funding of all of our vehicle replacements through reserve contributions and implementing a capital asset renewal funding strategy in 2020 that is specifically targeted towards facilities, life cycle funding, as well as the waste management capital reserve. And the reason for this is, as we've said before, we have some areas that are reasonably well funded, other areas are not, and we have, I would say, an over-reliance on debenture funding. We've estimated that the incremental contribution for asset renewal is somewhere in the $40 to $45 million range a year. What we've tried to do this time is show this in a little bit of a different way, so I'll be interested in feedback from council to see if this is effective or not. So what we've tried to show here, I'm just going to leave aside the numbers on the right-hand side just for the moment. We've tried to display visually the level of pay-as-you-go funding by service. So going back to our discussion about water and wastewater capital, we would say, for the most part, asset renewal funding within water and wastewater is funded through the user rates. We're not issuing any significant amount of debt for renewal funding in water and wastewater. And so that's the blue line, those two blue lines right at the top. And then as we work our way down, we have varying degrees of funding, appropriate funding in place for different services. And if we go right down to the bottom, we can see the areas that I think we've been focusing on for the most part over the last few years, which is regional facilities, housing, and waste management. We would say are the three areas that require the most significant amount of incremental funding in order to not be issuing debt for renewal work in those areas. And so we have a range. We have some areas that are very well funded. We have a number that are not nearly as funded as we think they should be. And I've just circled here the green area. That's the progress we're proposing to make through the 2020 budget. So we have added funding into the 2020 budget in order to help to solve this problem. It's relatively small in the grand scheme of things, but we're obviously cognizant of the ability for taxes to be increased, but we do want to continue to make progress. And so we thought this might be a good visual way of showing where we are right now and the progress that we're proposing to make through the 2020 budget. And then the figures on the right-hand side give you the order of magnitude. So there's the estimated dollar gap in each of those areas. And you can see it's most significant in facilities, housing, waste, and GRT bus replacement. That being said, we're not too concerned about GRT bus replacement right now because for the foreseeable future, we have a source of funding through the IKIP program for bus replacements. So yes, it's a shortfall, but it's not one that we need to get at nearly as quickly as the three down at the bottom. And you can see on the right-hand side, we've estimated right now the figure is in the range of $44 million of the overall shortfall that we're trying to remedy. So I hope that's helpful just to give some context to why we've added the funding into the budget that we have.
Sorry, one moment. Councillor?
So what's the dollar amount for the Green Park, Craig?
Yep, it's about $3.7 million. 3.7. So we would say, okay, on a estimated gap of 44 million, it's about maybe 8 or 9% of that gap.
So am I right, that would be about 0.75% on the tax bill then?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
Very good.
Thank you.
And then on the growth side, we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago about Bill 108 and Bill 138. So you recall that Bill 108 has amended the Development Charges Act to freeze the determination of DCs at an earlier date and put in a bunch of deferred payment plans, causing all kinds of challenges for municipalities who use DCs to fund growth. Bill 138 had first reading on November 6th, which I would say solves the commercial industrial problem, but leaves a bunch of other challenges in place. So this was, again, I think a big step forward. As I mentioned earlier, there's a report coming forward to A&F next week with staff recommendations on Bill 138, which will suggest, which will recommend that Bill 138 be amended in order to repeal most of what Bill 108 does. We think there's a case for that. We think it's highly problematic, both in terms of the deferred payment arrangements and the introduction of the community benefits charge. And so that's what will be in that report, and we'll have some conversation about that next week. So excuse me, in terms of the overall amount of growth, we talked about water and wastewater. We're also, the capital program contemplates about $95 million of growth-related debt for transportation. So those are the three areas. Those are the largest components of our development charge. So not surprisingly, they're the largest debt-funded areas as well that we're keeping a watch on. So this is a repeat of the slide that we showed back in water and wastewater, but we added transportation to the list. So you can see on the road side that we're currently sitting at about 5 or 6%. And if we issue, excuse me, the debt that we're proposing over the course of the capital program, we would end up at or about the 20% range. So I would say, a little bit less of a concern than water and wastewater, but obviously something that we're watching, and it does contribute, again, to the overall amount of debt that the region is proposing to issue. And that looks like this. So this is our debt outstanding. We've been relatively stable, I would say now, for 4 years in the high six, just below $700 million. We think that's going to continue, excuse me, through the end of 19 and through the end of 20 as well. And then we're anticipating it will increase as we issue debt for a number of significant projects. And we've shown this slide before. This is our debt to reserve ratio. This is one of the ratios that we watch. We know that our credit rating agency watches. We're the top number there, sitting at just below 2. We'd like to be closer to 1. And you can see that most of our, or all of our comparators are at or below a 1-to-1 ratio. So again, that's just, further indication of why we're watching so carefully the amount of debt that we issue.
Greg, if you'll hold for a moment, please. Councillor Herb.
Just back to the previous slide, remind me the debenture issues that the region just did in the last 2 or 3 months. For what period is that related to that slide?
So the debt that we issued in the fall, if I recall, was a combination of 10 and 20-year debt. So it'll be reflected, I would say, in full in the 2019 number, and then small pieces of it start to get paid off as we move into 2020, 2021, and beyond. So it's just, it ends up getting reflected in, actually in this case, it's going to be in both the taxation and the development charge portions of this chart. And if there's some specific information, specific numbers you want to see relating to those issues, we can easily put that together.
No, I was just curious because the rate was good.
The rate was delightful.
Very good, yeah. And so going past the 22 or 23, does it make a difference in this graph?
So really good question. So it doesn't, because this graph is simply showing the amount of principal debt outstanding. So this graph doesn't reflect the cost of borrowing or interest costs. It reflects the actual amount of debt that is outstanding on the market. Okay, so key messages. We're on the home stretch now, Madam Chair. Key messages, we want to build operating budget capacity to finance state of good repair. That's the area where we want to not be issuing debt, and then we can focus our debt on new infrastructure, growth, expansions, again, both growth and non-growth shares. We want to mitigate that growth-related financing risk, right? So those charts that show the percentages of DCs that are committed to funding debt servicing costs, we want to make sure we're mitigating that. And of course, overall, our goal, we want to maintain our credit rating and just find that right balance between net debt and non-debt financing. So transportation. So there was a request last time for some additional information about the transportation budget. So we've got a slide here that just shows, so overall transportation is one of our larger service areas funded from the levy, a little over $50 million, has an operations component, a planning and admin and engineering component, and a contribution to capital component. We've taken the operations piece here and then split it up even further. Winter maintenance, operations admin, traffic signals, you can see all the different categories there. On the capital side, we have a $1 billion capital program for roads over the next 10 years. Part of it is what we refer to as the base program, so reconstruction, rehabilitation, resurfacing of existing roads, and then we have system expansion. New roads, new lane capacity for the most part, and then vehicles and equipment and buildings. And we fund it. Similar to other programs, we have grants. So this is where we use our federal gas tax funding is for roads rehabilitation. We have development charges, And then we have the roads capital reserve and of course debt as well. So you can see that the 95 million in RDC debt, that's obviously one of the areas we're watching closely, as well as on the levy supported debt of another $90 million. And with that, I'd like to just turn the microphone over to Steve Vandekeer, who has a handful of slides relating to the roads capital program.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the Budget Committee. I've got a brief presentation about the transportation network and how maintaining it in a good state of repair is going to put some upward pressure on capital and operating budgets into the future. The sky isn't falling, but we want to bring this to Council's attention as something that staff are keeping an eye on and keep them up to date on as we move forward into future budgets. So a little bit about the existing network. The regional road network has over 1,700 lane kilometers of arterial roadway, 36 roundabouts, 525 signalized intersections, over 2,000 non-signalized intersections, 175 bridges and culverts, and 780 kilometers of cycling facilities. Including other features like retaining walls and noise walls, the value of the total network is estimated at about $1.6 billion. So keeping this network in a good state of repair is a challenge and is going to put some upward pressures on capital and operating budgets. So maintaining in a good state of repair. So some upward pressure for future roads rehabilitation capital budgets and some upward pressure on the roads operation budget. Some of it is reflected in the 2020 draft budget, and others will be as part of future budgets. So let's have a look at the existing road network that we have. 25% of the region's road network is in very good shape. So it looks like this, no cracks. So fairly new pavement. Treatment for pavement like this is routine summer and winter maintenance. Beautiful. Another 25% of the network is what we would consider in good condition. Some cracking, again, mostly routine summer and winter maintenance, but some crack sealing required to keep it serviceable. This is the segment I'm most concerned about, is the section which is in fair condition. About 1/3 of the network is considered to be in fair condition. Treatment for these types of roads generally requires some form of resurfacing. Whether it's a single lift, a shave and pave, or it could be a double lift, but generally that's the treatment required for this type of road. If it's left to degrade any further, it can get into the poor category. Unfortunately, only 15% of our network is in the poor condition right now. Basically, you can see from this photo, if you see all the little cracks near the center line, we call those alligator cracking. This pavement has basically failed. So the treatment for this is completely replacing the asphalt or completely reconstructing the entire pavement structure, including curb and gutter and drainage features as well. So let's look at how pavement degrades, asphalt pavement. This graph shows how pavement degrades. The vertical axis on the left is pavement condition. The bottom very poor, the top very good. And the x-axis along the bottom is the age of the pavement in years, starting at 0 on the left and 35 on the right. You can see it doesn't degrade in a linear fashion. That for the first 10 years or so, it stays in fairly good shape, but then things start to go bad fast. And generally around year 16 is kind of a critical time where we would target doing some form of a significant rehabilitation, usually a resurfacing. You can see that with the blue dot, that point. That cost for that type of a treatment is around $90,000 per lane kilometer. But you can see how quickly, if you were to defer that resurfacing, you can see fairly quickly, you can see fairly quickly with the red dot how in a few short years You can, in some cases, slip into a condition where the road has now become poor, and you're looking at a rehabilitation treatment which is 10 times that cost at $850,000 a lane kilometer. So it's critical that we try and do the resurfacing treatments at the right time. We want to get the most bang for the buck out of the pavement when it's new and do the resurfacing at just the right time. This is a challenge, of course. So if we defer these resurfacings, we can get into a situation where some of those fair pavements now enter the poor category. And the scope of work to do the treatments is going to be 10 times as high. So based on a 16-year cycle, we should be resurfacing about 108 lane kilometers per year. Based on the current funding in the program, we are doing about 50 lane kilometers per year. So we've got a bit of a shortfall that we're keeping an eye on of about 58 lane kilometers per year. So that equals about 5.2 million. So as a minimum, it looks like we have a shortfall, at least on the resurfacing side, of just over 5 million. Now, in a previous slide, you saw that we have identified an overall shortfall of about 7.5. So we're in the ballpark there. I think through the new asset management plan, which will be developed in 2020, we'll be confirming some of those numbers and those deficits, but we're definitely in the neighborhood of 5 to 10 million. So that's kind of my summary here, is the shortfall really overall in the roads rehabilitation program is in the order of 5 to 10 million. And so pushing projects ahead not only defers the work, but also changes the scope of the work. So we have to keep an eye on that sort of thing.
The resurfacing, are we just talking about asphalt and no base preparation or fixing up?
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair. Yeah, resurfacing is basically shaving off a layer of asphalt, milling it, and then replacing it. And sometimes that's only 2 inches. Sometimes that would be 4 inches or 5 inches of asphalt.
And is that what's, just as an example, is that what's happening now, or proposed between, on Westmount between Erb and Glasgow?
That was one component of that project when it was originally scoped, is some resurfacing. Generally, you're leaving the curbs in place with some minor repairs on a resurfacing project.
Thank you.
Councilor Keeler?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Steve, how do we stack up in other regions in terms of resurfacing? Are we below, in the middle, above, in terms of us doing it, not doing it?
Through you, Madam Chair, in comparison to other municipalities, our pavement quality is pretty good. I mean, on average, our pavement quality is in the top end of the fair. So we're in pretty good shape, and I think the other municipalities we can compare with they're in and around in the same range. How much more resurfacing they do as compared to us, I'm not sure on that. I can look into it. The other thing that we need to look at is we need to be a little bit more aggressive on our crack sealing. Because if we can be more aggressive on that in the early stages of the pavement life, I think we can help to give that pavement a little extra life so that it doesn't fall down that slippery, fast slope as quickly. Because it's the water getting into the asphalt that really destroys it, especially with the freeze-thaw cycles. But I can take a look at that in a bit more detail for you.
I know that the technology is improving every day on things like those cracks and splits and things like that, so it's important. So thanks for the information.
So if more of our pavement structures get into the poor range, then we're going to have increased maintenance, more potholes, more patching, more spot repairs, and it will have pressure on our area maintenance contracts because there's an assumption from the area municipalities that our pavement will be in a certain condition for their maintenance, for their routine maintenance. If it is in a poorer condition, their level of routine maintenance will go up, and that'll put upward pressure on those area maintenance contracts. Okay. The other thing, when you have poor pavement, you do get some increased resident concerns. And there is also the increased risk of more claims from residents that are getting into motor vehicle collisions on poor pavement. Something to keep an eye on as well.
Steve, if you can hold for a second.
Sure.
Steve, Steve, in a perfect world, you would be on top of this and you'd have enough money and we would do the preventative maintenance. But obviously, it's not a perfect world and there's a shortfall. How do we coordinate with local municipalities? Does that drive how we do this maintenance work, or is this something that we do independent of what the conditions are on local roads that feed into regional roads?
Through you, Madam Chair, that's one of the fun challenges we have, is coordinating different programs together. So a lot of times we will always program the need for the surface repairs based on the condition of the pavement or when we think it's going to need to be done. But there's an overlay then as well. If there's underground servicing, whether it's our own or it could be area municipality underground services that need to be replaced, then we might have to look at moving the project up, because the greater need is the service replacement and not the pavement replacement. Or sometimes the project has to move out, further out, because the municipality isn't prepared in their own program to replace that service at that time. So there's a little bit of competing needs, but we work well with them to try and coordinate those projects so that they happen at the right time that works for the most part for both municipalities. But it is a challenge, and I think we do a fairly good job of coordinating those programs, but sometimes when a deferral happens, it does have an impact on the other municipality, whether they have to wait longer because we have to wait longer because our pavement's sitting longer in bad condition, or for instance, one of the cities might be having more water main breaks that they have to deal with while they're waiting for us to get that program.
Any specific city with water main breaks?
Breaks happen everywhere, so it's a challenge.
I appreciate that, because I know what I hear from constituents, I'm sure everybody does, is they get tired of hearing whether it's a regional road or a local road, but the reality is we do our best to coordinate that. And I hear that about bike lanes and signage and line painting. I'm sure you hear all that too. So the better coordinated we are, I think the better it is for the end user.
Absolutely.
Councillor Lawrence?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Through you to Mr. Vanderker. Steve, I noticed the province more and more is using concrete on the 400 series roads, and I know that it's very expensive, but it seems that it really does take the wear and tear a lot better than asphalt. Have we ever considered looking at using it on our high volume roads, or is that something that is just completely off our price point?
Through you, Madam Chair, we've definitely thought about it over the years. In my previous life in design and construction, we considered using it, I think, for the Fairway Road extension. Concrete does last much longer, it's more durable, but it comes at least twice the price, and it becomes really problematic if you're cutting services into it or you're putting in manholes. So the MTO has been successful in using it on highways like the 407 because there's no servicing under those highways. There's never anybody cutting a new line to a manhole and so on, which happens frequently on regional roads. From time to time, we still consider it if it's a brand new road where we know there won't be a lot of servicing connections. But if you look at the bulk of our urban network, there's so many manholes, there's so many service connections, and then through redevelop new connections, it can create a lot of challenges if you've got concrete pavement, because now you have to cut out a piece of the concrete, and then you need to put in a temporary patch, and then wait to come back and dowel in. It makes the repairs for stuff like that really expensive, and the initial capital cost is really, really high. But we certainly thought about it, and we keep it in mind for projects coming up.
And going back to that graph where you showed how the asphalt deteriorates so quickly, but I think about the surface cuts and all the other things that happen out there, water main breaks, anything that really adds to that a lot more quickly. That's probably just the average, right? Without that.
That's a very typical curve that I showed. It's more theoretical, like every road will behave a little differently, and roads that are in areas that are undergoing a lot of redevelopment with a lot of service connections, that asphalt is going to deteriorate much more rapidly, because every time there's a cut and there's a patch, that's an opportunity for water to get in there, and then it contributes to going down that steep, slippery slope.
So how far off do you think vehicles flying is? And then we would just use the road as a guideline as opposed to drive on it. It's okay, you don't have to answer that.
Okay, George.
Councillor Galloway.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to pursue just a little different tack that Councillor Lawrence did. Rather than concrete, there are there not innovations in asphalt in terms of formulas and components? Are we looking at those that might extend the life? Locally, we have one of the world's experts on pavement, Dr. Susan Dyer, at the University of Waterloo. She does an awful lot of work, has in the past done an awful lot of work. She's not currently doing it. In trying to prolong the life of asphalt. Now, I suspect it comes with some premium, potentially, but are we at least looking at different asphalt mixes that extend the life of our roads?
Through you, Madam Chair, yeah, we're always looking for improved pavement mixes and ways of installing it. We've worked extensively with Dr. Dyer at the university to look at test sections, and we've incorporated them into some of our projects to see how they worked. We've looked at incorporating different materials from a recycling point of view to avoid all the use of new materials for pavements as well. It's not just the materials and the technology. A lot of times it's the installation quality as well, so that can be a challenge as well, as to make sure that we're working with contractors that are also staying on top of things. But I think we are doing well on that in terms of keeping an eye on the contractors. It's always a challenge, and I know my colleagues in design and construction are always looking for new and innovative ways of getting better pavement, and joints as well. Joints are the bigger problem, not necessarily just the mat. So getting good joints between the different lanes that are paved is key to keeping that water out of the asphalt.
Councillor Foxton.
Thank you, through the chair. Just to respond to Chair Redmond. So this year in 2020, Northumberland Street in Ayr will be being done, which means that the township had to defer 3 of their roads to do. And that's okay, because we know that we need those roads to move the traffic while Northumberland is being done. So we work like that quite often. In response to Councillor Lawrence, actually, Thomas, and please correct me, did we not? We concreted, but it's a special kind of concrete on Sprague's Road, and I believe the region won an award for it. Yep. It was a more cost-efficient program.
That's right, but that one was put back. It was originally concrete, and we reinstated it as concrete. I believe there's actually an extra lift put on, but exactly as Steve said, we have evaluated different materials to try and extend the life of the asphalt or the road. We also, installation is, as Steve mentioned, critical, so we're doing a lot of our paving at night now, and that's partially that is to limit impact on the traveling public, but it also allows us to do basically bigger sections, wider sections, limit the number of joints that you have. So really trying to do things to improve the quality of the original work, which then is critical. If you can gain a year or 2 of service, and that curve says 16 years, but Steve's staff are out there monitoring that on an annual basis to go, can we get an extra year out of it or not? Because it's important to try and get that. We don't want to go too long. If you go too long, the risk you take is the much more costly replacement, but definitely trying to extend that life as much as we can.
Thank you. And one last comment is I was driving through the Durham area quite a while ago, and in that county, they had done different textures on this one strip of road. So it was about 20 kilometers straight, and every 2 kilometers was a different texture to see how they would hold up. And I wish communities would share data like that, so that when they find something that works, they would share it with other municipalities.
And just before you continue on, Steve, what is it when you see the asphalt that's got that pink tinge to it? What's the property? Is that some kind of a new? Do you know what I mean? When you start seeing some of that pink, I think I saw it mostly on the 401 a few years ago. It had more of a pink color to it.
It's likely the type of aggregate that they're using.
That's all it was?
Yeah, wherever it's locally sourced, it has more of a particular aggregate in it that's got that color, maybe more iron content, which is where the red color would come from generally. Not an asphalt expert. I know enough. I can ask my colleagues in D&C if you need more information on stuff like that.
No, that's fine. Sure, you'd know if it was important. Thank you. Okay, so carry on.
All right. Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I've got a couple slides left. I'll try and get through them quickly. Just a little bit of information and a heads up to Council about future operating budget pressures. In our capital projects now, we're adding things, valuable things that are much needed, but we're adding things to the road allowances that we never built before. Things like, as you can see in this photo, colored pavement markings. We're also adding things like advanced traffic signal management systems to be started next year, of course, with cameras and other sophisticated equipment at intersections. All this new infrastructure does require to be maintained and at some point replaced. So just as an example, this intersection that you see here, there's about $20,000 to $25,000 worth of pavement markings in this intersection. And that needs to be replaced on a 5 to 7 year cycle. At about $250 a square meter. So there's a cost to it, but and in the urban area, that's what we're doing. We're building more urbanized cross sections. We're reducing storage for snow because we're doing a better job of clearing bike lanes. So if we don't have room to store the snow, it has to be lifted. So those sorts of things are going to add some pressures to future operating budgets. It's just a heads up, and we're going to keep an eye on those things and keep council informed on some of those issues. Another factor is climate change. So, we're going to have a lot more freeze-thaw cycles in the future than we have now, a lot more freezing rain. Southern Ontario is going to be significantly impacted by climate change. When I was a kid, it would be cold for 40, 50 days in a row. That's fantastic for roads. Get really cold, stay cold. But this above zero, below zero, above zero, below zero stuff is absolutely terrible for asphalt pavement. And it's going to, and also the additional freezing rain means more application of winter maintenance de-icing chemicals. So more winter maintenance costs and also more summer maintenance costs in terms of pothole patching and so on. That's just going to be part of doing business and keeping the roads in serviceable shape as we move into these changes that are going to happen. A little bit about what some of the pressures that we've incorporated into the draft 20 budget, operating budget. Things like increased winter maintenance, increased price of salt, went up about 25%. We've got more snow lifting and a higher cost for that. Again, because of what I just mentioned earlier with more urbanized sections. And better maintenance of bike lanes is also adding to some of the operating costs for 2020. And again, we also have some additional operating costs with respect to the advanced traffic signal management system, putting that in, maintaining it in service level agreement and so on. Those are just a little heads up on what's incorporated into the 20 draft budget. So in summary, rehabilitation funding, the shortfall is around $5 to $10 million per year. It's something, like I said, the sky isn't falling, but staff are keeping an eye on this. Because if we let too many of those roads slip into the poor condition, there's going to be a snowball effect that is going to really significantly increase costs exponentially in the future. And there will be some increases required on the operating side. So thanks very much for your time. I'm happy to take more questions if there are any.
I don't see any. Oh, wait.
Just for curiosity, the shortfall, how would that compare to 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Is it falling behind?
Through you, Madam Chair, it depends from year to year how much we've programmed in the 10-year, and we do make adjustments based on available funding and where some projects are. So I think it's been hovering around that for a while. It hasn't changed significantly. In the 2015 asset management plan, we identified an $8.7 million sort of gap in the renewal for transportation. So we're still very much in that range of 5 to 10. We heard 7.5 earlier today. So things have been fairly steady, and that's what we're looking at, around 5 to 10 million.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Galway?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Steve, this is more philosophical, I guess, but I'll tie it to budget. So in the region's master transportation plan, and more recently in our strategic plan, we want to enact or encourage a significant modal shift, a fairly significant modal shift in transportation. So is there a relationship between what we spend on roads and the modal shift that we're trying to encourage? If we wanted, if council made a conscious decision to go to service level E or D or whatever service level, does that save us money on your budget, on the roads capital budget, that we then can put into transit or put into active transportation facilities? Is there a relationship? I'm not
That's a
asking
good
you
question.
to quantify it, but you know, I think the climate change thing is in the master transportation plan and other, you know, strategic plan and so on. We want to really incent the modal shift, and so is there a theory that the better the road system, the more cars we get, the easier it is for people to use their car, or should we be not necessarily shortchanging our road system, but drawing back on it to some extent and accepting maybe lower levels of service? That's not necessarily the same as lower level of maintenance in favor of modal shift.
Well, through you, Madam Chair, if you want to get the active modes to increase, you've got to reduce the barriers that some of those users or potential users are seeing. And some of those are safety related, some of those are convenience related. So we need a system that's more connected, more seamless, and also that users feel safer. So, and finding that space in the road allowance is always going to be a challenge. So on some projects, we're going to consider looking at taking away driving lanes to provide that space. If the road is narrower, in theory, there's less road to plow, but if it's replaced with a high-quality cycling facility, for instance, that level of maintenance is still going to be required. In fact, it may even be higher. But the other thing you have to think about is people make personal choices. So it's not, so people choose to drive their cars because it's convenient for them and their perceived cost of that transportation is low. So somehow, and it's not all something that the region can influence, but somehow over time, that perceived cost needs to go up in order for people to start considering alternative modes. If we want them to use transit, the buses need to drive on roads as well. And the thing is, the pavement structures are basically designed for trucks and for buses. Passenger cars don't beat up our roads that much. It's buses and trucks. So as long as we still have to accommodate goods movement on regional roads and buses, we're still going to have fairly thick pavement structures, and we're going to have to rehab those roads on a regular basis. But if the roads could be narrower and replaced with other facilities, you know, it's a good question, because if we're just replacing with another facility that still requires a high level of maintenance, our operating costs may actually go up over time. But in terms of capital costs and capital replacement, I could see at some point if there was significant mode shift, as we're looking at on certain projects, we could live with fewer driving lanes. Yes, that will have an impact in terms of the delays to those drivers. And it'll be a question of whether, you know, collectively the community is ready for that when those things start to be introduced. That'll be a good question. We'll see what happens. I mean, and some of the projects that we're actually looking at right now are going to challenge and put those questions out there.
Yeah, and I look forward to that conversation and discussion and pilots or whatever. But is it, and maybe this is too theoretical, but if we ever did achieve those kind of modal shifts that we have in our master transportation plan, would our roads last longer? Would we be reconstructing, rehabbing at 16 years, or would it be at 20 years? I mean, is there an actual payback on that side for the modal shift when it comes to roads?
Again,
and we have a shortfall of $5 to $10 million a year. So is it even conceivable that transit in active transportation could actually take up that shortfall?
Again, most of the, what deteriorates our roads are the bus and truck traffic. So as long as those numbers stay stable, I don't see huge.
Well, transit could go up in that scenario.
And even, so then that would be somewhat worse for the roads.
Sure.
But a worthwhile challenge. So, yeah, those types of vehicles are the ones that do the most damage to our roadways, particularly trucks, heavy trucks. And because we've got the regional roads, we're going to have the regional. Now, if changes occur in the future of how goods are delivered, again, we're really projecting our minds out here. But that, if there's less trucks on the road, then that would have a significant difference on our roadways. So.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you, ma'am. The road through Baden, Snyder's Road, I was just informed that it's been delayed yet again, and I think this time it's actually the township's fault, but I'm not sure. Which is, yeah, we can go with that. But, I mean, it is the third time it's been delayed. The other thing I want to talk about is that when redoing, I understand in the city how things are done with the roads and that, but a few years ago we went through a process in Petersburg, and the roads were all redone, but it took us 3 years to get it done because there was a lot of conversation back and forth, which I think a lot of that conversation could have been lessened right from the beginning, because I think I understand the conversation, but there were things that were changed and made the people happy. Now we're going to go through the same thing in St. Agatha, because I mean, I've had phone calls already that there are things there that the people are suggesting, you know, extending a sidewalk for 3 houses past 6 houses that don't have any frontage. 3 of them don't have frontage, and the last 3 don't have a sidewalk now, and they're not interested in a sidewalk. There could be a savings there, and these people are very adamant the fact that they don't want that sidewalk. They don't need it. The other part of it is that there are things that are in the design that, I mean, it's eliminating some handicap parking right in front of the church. And I mean, I got a text today about 2 or 3 different people that attend that church that require that in order to get in. There's going to be having the bike lanes. There's a concern that obviously the people aren't getting the story as to how the snow removal is going to be maintained with the bike lanes, which are right up against the sidewalks that are going in, and it's going to create a problem. If there's 2 or 3, you get 2 or 3 plows during the day coming through, it's going to create a problem there. So I think there needs to be a lot more communication, and I think closer communication, because I know there's a petition out there, roughly 500 names, that's going to be coming to us, and there's going to be people coming to committee and to council to have this discussion, and it's going to be people are, and I think part of it is that there's a misunderstanding as to how things are done, but I'm not sure if the misunderstanding sometimes is within staff or just the people don't understand. I mean, at one time I was told, going through Mannheim, that the idea is that the bike lanes are there, and in the wintertime they'll be used to store snow until it can be lifted out. But when you listen to people talking about using bike lanes, well, you can't be depositing snow in the bike lanes because then they can't use it. So there's a contradiction there as to what's going on. So I think there needs to be some more clarification, a lot more thought put into this, and I think a lot more communication with the people in St. Agatha and other locations, especially out in the country where it's a lot different than city streets. So it's just my comment. Hopefully people can get the message.
Of course, Mike.
Madam Chair, if I could just make a couple of comments. So, yeah, good question. What does it have to do with budget? Maybe not a lot. But I actually think there's some really important points here, and I'm just going to make a couple general comments, and maybe Steve or Thomas want to add. So if I think back to the Petersburg project, I'm trying to recall that a little bit, and I'm not quite as familiar with the current St. Agatha project. So one thing I would say is always room for more and better communication. So, I think regional staff take that to heart. We can always do more. We can always do better in terms of communication. Having said that, I think what we're dealing with is this is what we're going to hear more of when we try to prioritize active transportation. And I think back to the conversations that this council had as part of the STRAT plan, and I think about some of the very clear directions that staff heard in those discussions that this council wants to prioritize active transportation. So when you start prioritizing cycling lanes and sidewalks, there inevitably is going to be some impact on lanes, lane width, and parking. And so this council is going to continue to hear from people who aren't happy about that. And so I think what this council is going to have to deal with over the next year or two or three on a project-by-project basis is, do you believe in your strategic priorities around active transportation on a project-by-project, case-by-case basis? And I think that's where, okay, bad analogy, the metal's going to hit the road. That's where I think push is going to come to shove is you are going to have to deal with a theoretical priority and a practical reality. So that, I think, is the path in front of you. I don't know if Thomas, you want to add any more to my philosophical rant?
I think I would add that staff recognize the impacts on both pedestrian cyclists, the motoring public, and the residents there, and we try to strike a balance. We can obviously communicate more. I mean, parking, for instance, another complaint we often get in rural areas is speeding. One of the ways to slow down cars is to actually not have that parking, to narrow that road and not have that empty parking space there. So two things, people want the parking, they want people to drive slower. How do we find the balance? I think really that's what staff are trying to do is in all these projects, try to find that balance of active transportation, pedestrian cyclists, the motoring public, the residents of the community. And it's difficult. It's not an easy thing, and it won't be easy for council to deal with it. We've seen it in Petersburg. I think we will see it on every single one of these projects because everyone has different perspectives on it. And we'll make it as easy as we can from a staff perspective, but council will have some difficult decisions to make.
Okay, Councillor Armstrong.
Yeah, I understand all that, and I know some people are not going to be happy. In Petersburg, nobody wanted to shovel their sidewalk, so they didn't want sidewalks. But now that the sidewalks are in, people love it. They use it all the time. They love the idea to be able to walk down the road and use a sidewalk. They love that. And I don't think that in this case that they're talking about the fact that they absolutely don't want sidewalks throughout the whole village. What they're talking about certain areas. I mean, this is right at the edge of town. There's not going to be any development. So there's 6 houses there, and 3 of them are going to be greatly impacted because the front yard is going to be affected by the fact with the sidewalks. And those are things we have to think about. And the idea of parking spaces in front of the church for the handicapped, I mean, they're talking about putting a 2 or 3 foot boulevard in there, as far as I understand. I haven't seen the drawings myself, but that's what they were talking about, some short boulevard in there, and then people can't park their cars there and go to church, which is important in that community. So I understand that as long as we have communication, things can be worked out as they were in Petersburg, because there was going to be a lot of parking lost in Petersburg, and now people are happy it's okay, because we had the conversation, and there are areas that can be, instead of having a 1 or 2 foot grass boulevard, you have a paved boulevard where people can pull off the road. That's what all they're concerned about. So that's what I'm saying is we have those communication. And that's, I'm just hoping that it will continue, that's all.
Okay, Councillor Shantz.
Thank you. On a bit of a tangent here, I guess, but just to summarize for Councillor Armstrong, maybe is we need to look at each community and each area in the whole context, but also in the individual context in which surrounds those communities.
Big city, little city stuff, right?
You got it.
It's all important. Okay, I see no other speakers unless anybody's going to get tricky. Is anybody getting tricky? Okay. What's that?
Are we doing MFC?
What's the list of projects that could be deferred or delayed?
Oh. Well. Oh my goodness.
Through you, Madam Chair, so I didn't have a specific slide about Appendix C, but if we wanted to have some conversation about it, then that's fine. We can either do that now, or I can run through my last few slides and then turn our minds to it, as you wish.
My first question is, do we debt finance roads rehab at all, or is that all? Do we debt finance roads rehab in part?
It's a really good question, and I'll have to answer it in 2 ways. We have not issued any debt for roads rehabilitation in about the last 8 years. So we're very close to being, I'll call it, debt-free for roads rehab. In the capital program, in the 10-year capital program, we do identify, if you see on the right-hand side of this pie chart, levy-supported debt. So of the approximately $950 million of transportation capital spending over the next 10 years, we have identified about 9% of it as debt funded. Now, that happens predominantly, I think, in years, say, 2 to 6. And that's partly because we have a capital program that is a little heavier in the first 5 years than in the last 5 years. Our hope is that we can continue along the path of not issuing debt for roads rehab, but at this point we've identified it as a possibility in the capital program. Again, we're about 8 years now without doing it. That includes 2019. Our hope is that we don't have to in 2020, and it's something that we're just evaluating and trying to manage through each capital program.
So I guess what I'm trying to get at, though, Craig, is why don't we, why do we only debt finance system expansion? Why don't we debt finance roads rehab? Is it because it's a rehab versus new construction?
Yeah.
Although it's a 16-year build on some projects, I mean, it's kind of like a capital project. I know it's maintenance, but and I'm not suggesting we do more of it and debt finance it, but I'm just wondering why there isn't a split. The same amount of debt, only split between roads rehab and system expansion. And the reason I'm asking that is Schedule C. The only projects that are being suggested to be deferred or delayed in order to save debt financing costs are road expansion projects. Notwithstanding what Steve has just said about, you know, the sensitivity of the number of years that existing roads should go between reconstructions.
Yep. So through Madam Chair, I think the answer to that is a matter of source of funding. So the projects in Appendix C that have been deferred because of the funding challenges with respect to transportation development charges. And so if we think back to the previous slide that was showed, that showed that we're already anticipating having to issue about $95 million in growth-related debt for transportation expansion projects over the next few years. Our concern is that without these deferrals, that figure was closer to $160 or $170 million of growth-related debt over the same time period. So we're concerned about the risk, the DC collection and funding risk that we identified in the earlier slides today around our, the risk around the collection of development charges to fund those debt servicing costs. So the deferrals are directly related to our ability to fund road expansion projects through development charges.
Okay. It's really the quantum I'm getting at, the actual quantum of debt, which then Schedule C is a part of a potential strategy. And in regards to Schedule C, so you're not going to go through Schedule C line by line. You're not expecting.
So I wasn't expecting to, but if that's if Schedule C is something, Appendix C is something that Budget Committee wishes to have some conversation about, we can do that absolutely right now.
I'm curious as to where Schedule C is going to go. Is it just there for illustration purposes of what we might be able to do in order to save some debt financing? Is that a list of projects you're going to be expected to approve the deferral of? Because I've got one big concern on that list. So.
Yep, so it's a really good question. Appendix C is, I would say, is here for information. We're, I think, advising council of what has been reflected in the preliminary 10-year transportation capital program. So the capital program that's before you, that's part of the budget book that was published last week, reflects these deferrals. So I would say there's no specific decision to make, okay, I say other than approving the budget, unless you'd like to do something different than what's on Appendix C, because Appendix C is already reflected in the proposed transportation capital program.
Okay, well then I want to raise the River Road project that was to have been built 10 years ago. And if it hadn't been for the Jefferson Salamander, it would be long ago built. And there have been a number of delays, a number of deferrals on this project. And there's some really potential economic development opportunities that are related to that road that I think we need to take into consideration, and I do not want to defer that any further. In fact, we've already, I thought we had already, phase one was to go ahead, it was to be tendered. And we've had various delegations here related to phase one, and so my concern is any deferral on that, and would at the appropriate time, if it's already in the base budget as being deferred, would want it restored, would ask for it to be restored.
That's something that I would say that could either be dealt with through a motion, perhaps either.
Right now?
Well, you could do it now. You could do it on December 11th. You could equally do it on January 22nd.
So do you want to just leave it at that? No? Or do you want, Jeff, do you want to add to that? Sorry?
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with Councillor Galloway, and I'd be happy to second the motion. I think it's not just that it's been pushed off for the last 10 years, but it's also, it's designed to be a reliever for Fairway Road, which just keeps getting more and more traffic on it. So I certainly would support that. I guess the question I have for you, Craig, is I'm kind of lost here. The agenda ended back at the end of water distribution, and I'm not sure where we're at, or usually we have an agenda at these meetings where you can say, oh, so we're on page 87 or whatever, and I don't have that. And I don't think the chair does either. That's why she was prepared to adjourn the meeting after water distribution and wastewater.
Well, she didn't even do her opening remarks yet.
Yeah, I know. And I'm not being critical. I'm just kind of lost here. I don't
Right.
really
So
know.
I think the agenda listed all the presenters. It may have left Mr. Van de Keer off accidentally because I think it was a bit of a late addition. My presentation is perhaps just a little bit awkward because it comes and goes between the various speakers, and it didn't seem necessary to repeat my presentation each time I was going to get up to speak. So I think we have...
Well, maybe I didn't get the right one, because I don't have even people that are speaking on this agenda, so I don't...
So
maybe it's just me,
okay.
I don't know, but I...
So I'm not sure what happened, Madam Chair. We have an agenda for the meeting with all the speakers and all the items that were being dealt with, so I'm not sure exactly what happened, but we can look into it and make sure it doesn't happen again.
It's kind of nice to be able to follow it. And
Understood.
Figure out where we're at.
Absolutely.
So
We'll make sure that doesn't happen next time. My
Councillor
apologies.
Galloway, are you going to make that motion?
Oh, I apologize, Councillor Galloway.
If it's appropriate to do it at this time, I mean, we can do it at whenever we're approving the capital budget too.
Again, Madam Chair, we're in your hands. If Budget Committee wishes to pass a motion to make an amendment to the budget as presented, that can happen at any time at any of your meetings.
Well, I'll make a motion to reinstate the River Road project its original timing in the 10-year capital forecast.
Well, I guess we have quorum, so. I just want to, there's quite a few speakers, so can we just, can we suspend that just ever so gently? Councillor Erb, do you still want to speak? You had enough of it? Hang on.
Part of the afternoon for me is I found out that the life of a road is the same as the shingles on your roof. 15. I just want to say I think we should deal with it today so that it can be worked into what the rate is for when we approve the budget.
Thank you for that. And I think Councillor Shantz was next.
Thank you. I don't have a problem revisiting River Road. I know it's a good project for a number of reasons, but I would like to also know what's going to be taken off to do River Road, because, oh, okay. Okay, I mean, I'm assuming it would mean some kind of shuffling of priorities, and I know we have a few areas that really need looking at too, and well, that's Larry. Larry talks about it.
So, Madam Chair, so one suggestion might be we could bring this back for December the 11th and just indicate, here are the implications from a budget and financial perspective, and here's what staff are proposing in terms of a reinstatement, to use Councillor Galloway's terminology. And we could bring that back for December the 11th. And then you'll have the whole picture in front of you. And in terms of, and just to be clear, in terms of funding, the funding source is very likely to be just the issuance of growth-related debt.
So do I want to move our seconder for that, or does all these other lights have something they want to add to it, or?
But it'll come back, right, then, on December?
Okay, so the mover and seconder have to, okay, and so now we're looking for a motion.
Sorry. Can I just ask one more question before we go? When you talk about Schedule C, is that the 10-year capital budget forecast that I have here, or am I not finding it?
So if you go to page 18 in your budget committee agenda package for today, so everybody can find page 18. That's, I believe, the Appendix C that Councillor Galloway is referring to. And
right.
And it's a list of 5 or 6 projects that in the current draft capital program, staff have deferred the timing of these 6 growth-related projects. And the primary reason for it is the discussion that Craig had earlier about our concern about growth-related debt, because these are development charge funded, and I think we would need to issue debt for all of these. And so that risk that Craig talked about, and us basically debt financing these projects on the assumption that growth materializes, exposes the region to some risk. And that was staff's rationale for proposing or including deferral of these. But we did want to, the reason we included this appendix is we wanted to point out to council these projects in the current draft capital program have been deferred. So rather than you having to wade through the dozens of pages of the capital program, we've summarized it all in one place to have this kind of conversation.
Okay, so it looks like you've
It'll come back.
So we'll just let it come back to us then with some more information. Thank you. Carry on.
So just a quick comment about user fees and charges. So this is on page 20 of your agenda. We've outlined here some of the areas where either fee increases or new permit fees in particular for transportation are being proposed. So just at a high level, GRT fare increase has been incorporated on the assumption of a 2% increase effective July 1st of 2020. Some proposed increases on the waste management side to various tipping fees effective April the 1st. Transportation is proposing to introduce some new permit and request fees as of the 1st of June, and some inflationary adjustments at the airport shown to be effective January 22nd, which is a budget approval date. The user fee and charge info paper outlines the additional revenue contemplated through those fee adjustments at various points throughout the year, and they total approximately $700,000. We thought it'd be worthwhile also to provide a continuity. This will probably show the complexity of budgeting for transit fare revenues and all of the various adjustments that were made. So this gets us from the $38.6 million budgeted in total in 2019 to the proposed $42.6 million budgeted in 2020, so a $4 million increase, which is comprised of a variety of different adjustments ranging from the annualization of fare increases, to the annualization of service expansions, to the introduction of Bundle 2 effective April 1st, to the UPass increase, to the adjustment for the low-income transit program that was approved earlier this year, and to the fare increase contemplated on the 1st of July of next year. So we thought there was just enough happening on the transit side that it was worth just showing all the different adjustments that resulted ultimately in that $4 million fare increase.
Madam Chair?
Coming.
I'll come. A couple of questions. One is, we got some possibly good news on the Conestoga College Transit UPass. So, and I think we need to take some action on that, but that's not necessarily for debate here today. But is that revenue, that revenue's not in here, obviously. Projected?
So through you, Madam Chair, so we have included in the base the annualization of the Conestoga College service that comes into effect on September the 1st. So assuming that carries on without a UPass, that's what we've presumed for the preparation of the base budget. If a UPass is, back on the table, then I think we would have to look at that and assess what the potential revenue implications would be. But we have certainly not factored that at this point into the 2020 budget.
But it would be a positive effect if everybody had to pay a reduced fare compared to however many students today pay the regular fare.
I believe it would be.
And we've already
I would have to go back and look.
Service accordingly, so there's no
We've increased the service. So we'd have to have a chat with GRT to both assess the service implications as well as the potential revenue implications as well. We have not done that in the base budget.
Well, I don't necessarily want to get into the service implications, but my understanding is that the additional service that we provided September 1st was in fact the service that was intended for the UPass. I don't know if there's an additional level of service that was expected by the students, which of course would be an additional cost. But I'm assuming that we would have additional revenue if in fact we were able to see ourselves clear to have the UPass there. So maybe that's for another day. But in our strategic plan, we are anticipating a fair review, a review of GRT fares, I believe. And so I'm wondering if there's any way of deferring the fare increase that's on this page. Can we just, at the appropriate time?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Either the percentage or the date or both.
That we're going to try to defer that.
Okay.
All right. We're good?
Okay, so just a couple of concluding slides then. Waterloo Region Police Service, so that budget is working its way through board approval, review and approval. The figures we presented here and in the staff report reflect the numbers that were presented to the board last Wednesday. So an overall expenditure level at 200 million, levy requirement at just under 182 million, so just about a 7.2% increase, and results in an overall tax rate impact of 1.67%. The board, so they had initial meeting back in October, met again in November. They'll be here next time, so 2 weeks from tomorrow. They'll be here for the next budget committee meeting to make their presentation, and approval of the police board budget is scheduled for the 18th of December. A quick reminder on public engagement. The strategy was approved by Budget Committee a couple of weeks ago. Will be to get input from citizens on the value of current service levels, as well as of the proposed service enhancements through the 2020 budget process. We did, in fact, go live on November the 20th and are expected to close on December 20th, so open for a month, and we'll provide the results of that public engagement to Budget Committee in early January. So our process then, after today, we have a public input session tonight. We'll reconvene in a couple of weeks to continue Budget Committee's review of the budget. We'll present the user rate budgets for approval on December the 11th. As I indicated, the police will be here, and then we'll have our second public input meeting, and then we'll break over the holidays and return on January 22nd for approval of the tax budget and user fees and charges. And I think I've been through everything here. With the addition, in December 11th, we'll have a report on the service review. Will be part of the agenda for December the 11th. And I should say, I believe December 11th is in your calendars right now with a 1 o'clock start. We're going to look at adjusting that start time. My thinking is it's probably around a 2:30 start will be adequate for us, but we'll sort that out over the next couple of days and get an update sent out. So key messages. So operations, we have pressure in terms of service contracts, in terms of winter maintenance, in terms of master plan approvals through budget issue papers, capital, combination of funding for asset renewal, ongoing challenges with respect to Bill 108 and Run 38, and the funding of discretionary development charge exemptions. And then the police budget, currently sitting at 7.2% levy increase, continued to be reviewed by staff and scheduled for approval by the board on December 18th. And with that, Madam Chair, if there are any final questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Nope, there we go. Councillor.
I'd like to go back to the Appendix C. So my understanding is that general construction costs of buildings, is going up about 1% a month. How does that relate to road construction? And so where does this offset if you defer a project now for 3 or 4 years with the DC costs? Like, is there a place where that washes out?
So with respect to the capital program, through you, Madam Chair, so all the projects in the capital program are costed in 2020 dollars. Right. So we do our best estimate of if we were doing all of these projects over the next 10 years, if they were being done today, what would the cost be? From a development charge perspective, then a couple things happen. So if a project is delayed, then as we go through successive capital programs, we would make adjustments to the cost to reflect the current cost of completing that project. On the DC side, we also go through an inflationary adjustment to the development charge itself. So there's an automatic indexing of the development charge every December the 1st. So in theory, the DC is going up. It's probably not a perfect mix because we have such a variety of projects in our capital program. But the DC is being indexed to reflect inflationary costs on the capital side.
Thank you. I wasn't aware of that. Thank you.
We're good to go.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
So that's good to go for sure. We're looking for a motion to adjourn, I think. Really for sure this time. Councillor Nowak, seconded by Councillor Armstrong. All those in favor? Carried. Thank you. 2 hands.